Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It happened when we were driving back from visiting my wife's parents. They live about 4 hours away, and we'd stayed longer than planned. The kids, my 7-year-old daughter and 4-year-old son, had fallen asleep in the back seat around 9, and we decided to just keep driving rather than wake them up for a hotel stop. It must have been close to midnight when we approached the Upper River campsite area. I remember checking the time on the dashboard and thinking how different everything looked in the dark. We'd actually camped there about 10 years ago, before the kids were born. It was this little nostalgic moment, you know. I remember nudging my wife and whispering, "Remember that place?" She smiled and squeezed my hand. The roads in that area are winding, lots of sharp turns hugging the mountainside. We were coming up on this really tight hairpin turn. I slowed down considerably because I know that stretch can be dangerous even in daylight. The guardrail on that curve has been repaired so many times from people taking it too fast. Just as we were entering the turn, my headlights swept across the rocky slope on the inside of the curve. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain tried to make it make sense. Was it a bear standing upright, a rock formation I was misinterpreting? But I've seen bears. This wasn't a bear. This thing was standing on the rock face, and when I say rock face, I mean a nearly vertical slope. Had to be at least 70 or 80 degrees. It was just standing there, not climbing, not struggling for balance, just standing as if the laws of gravity didn't quite apply to it the same way. When the headlights first hit it, it was hunched over, facing our direction. What struck me immediately were the eyes. Completely black. Not like dark brown eyes in shadow. I mean absolute, total blackness that seemed to absorb the headlight beams rather than reflect them. There was no discernible separation between pupil and iris. Just these two black voids set into its face. As a nurse, I've studied human anatomy extensively. This thing's proportions were wrong. Its torso wasn't shaped like a human's, with a tapered waist and defined chest. It was almost cylindrical, like a column. The arms were unnaturally long and thin, extending well below where the pelvis would be. The creature was covered in what looked like fur or hair, predominantly black, but with this silvery gray mixed throughout, giving it this aged, weathered appearance. Not like an animal's coat pattern, more like something that had once been black and had partially grayed with time. My wife saw it too. I heard her sharp intake of breath, felt her hand grip my arm so hard it left marks. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I couldn't even answer her. My mouth had gone completely dry. What happened next is what really haunts me. As our car approached, this thing, it moved. Not in a startled way, not like we'd surprised it. It moved with this deliberate slowness that felt calculating. It pivoted from its hunched position, straightening to its full height, which I'd estimate was around 7 feet tall. Then it tilted its head to look directly at us. Not in the way an animal might glance at headlights. This was a conscious, intentional movement. It was studying us. I instinctively hit the brakes, slowing even more. That's when I noticed how it was managing to stand on that near-vertical rock face. Its feet, or what should have been feet, seemed to have some kind of bend in the middle that allowed it to grip the rock surface. Almost like its foot had an extra joint that could flex in ways a human foot never could. We were probably only 20 feet away from it at this point. The headlights were illuminating it fully, and yet somehow the details of its face remained indistinct. Except for those eyes, those empty black eyes tracking our movement. My wife was frantically fumbling for her phone, whispering, "I need to get a picture, I need to get a picture," but her hands were shaking too badly to unlock it. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned white, trying to focus on not driving off the edge of the road. As we passed directly beside it, the creature turned its head to maintain eye contact. This sounds crazy, but I swear I felt a pressure in my head, like when your ears need to pop but won't. A strange heaviness settled over me, and for a split second, I had the overwhelming urge to stop the car completely. My wife must have felt something similar because she suddenly said, "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop the car." Her voice had this edge I'd never heard before, raw fear stripped of any pretense. I pressed on the gas, taking the rest of the curve faster than was safe. In the rearview mirror, I could see the creature pivot again, tracking our car as we moved away. It remained perfectly balanced on that impossible slope. Then we rounded the bend completely, and it was gone from view. For about 30 seconds, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the engine and our breathing, which had become shallow and rapid. The kids somehow remained asleep through all of this, which seems impossible given how charged the atmosphere in the car had become. "What the hell was that?" my wife finally whispered. I had no answer. My medical training was cycling through possibilities: a person with some rare condition affecting physical appearance, an animal I wasn't familiar with, but nothing fit. Nothing explained the way it moved, how it balanced, those eyes. "Should we call someone?" she asked, already pulling out her phone again. "Who would we call?" I replied. "And what would we say? That we saw something weird in the woods at midnight?" I was trying to be rational, but my heart was still hammering in my chest. My palms were so sweaty on the steering wheel that I had to wipe them on my jeans. We drove another 10 miles in silence, constantly checking the mirrors, before my wife spoke again. "It wasn't human," she said simply. "Not a question, a statement." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. I've spent weeks trying to research what we might have seen, searched for reports of unusual wildlife in the area, looked up local legends, even contacted a biologist at the state university under the pretense of academic curiosity. Nothing fits exactly what we saw. What keeps coming back to me are the details my mind registered in those few seconds, details my training as a nurse picked up on. The way its joints moved didn't follow human biomechanics. The center of gravity was all wrong for how it balanced. And those eyes, completely black, without sclera or visible iris, shouldn't be possible in any mammal I'm aware of. I find myself thinking about how it turned to watch us. That wasn't the behavior of an animal startled by headlights. There was purpose there, intelligence, and something else I can't quite name. We haven't told many people. Who would believe us? Even my most open-minded colleagues would suggest we were tired, that the headlights created strange shadows on a rock or tree. But both of us saw it. Both of us felt that strange pressure, that momentary compulsion to stop the car. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can feel those eyes watching me. On particularly bad nights, I check on the kids, make sure their windows are locked. I can't stop thinking about the Upper River campsite, about how we'd stayed there years ago, slept under the stars, hiked those same slopes. Had it been there then, watching us? Had others seen it and, like us, kept quiet out of fear of ridicule? My wife wants to move forward, forget about it. "It was nothing," she'll say when I bring it up. But her voice gets tight and she changes the subject immediately. I've caught her researching cryptozoology websites when she thinks I'm not looking. She's just as unsettled as I am. Last week I found myself pulling up maps of the area, studying the terrain around that hairpin turn. There's no logical reason a creature of that size could remain undocumented in a relatively popular recreation area. But then again, those woods are vast, and the more remote sections rarely see human traffic, especially at night. I keep coming back to how it stood on that rock face. Physics says it shouldn't have been able to balance like that. Human anatomy, any known mammalian anatomy, doesn't allow for that kind of positioning. The foot structure alone would have to be fundamentally different from anything I've studied. Sometimes I wonder if we should go back. In daylight, with other people, See if there's any evidence, footprints, hair caught on branches, anything. But then I remember those black eyes and that feeling of pressure in my head, and I know I won't. Some part of me is afraid of what might happen if it recognized us. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters or things that go bump in the night. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know it defies explanation. At least any explanation I'm comfortable with. The kids still don't know anything happened that night. They slept through the entire encounter, and we've kept it that way. I find myself watching them more carefully now when we're outdoors, staying closer, coming inside earlier when the sun starts to set. My wife and I have made an unspoken agreement not to drive that road again, especially after dark. We take the longer route to her parents' house now. It adds an hour to the trip, but neither of us has suggested going back to the original route. I don't know what was standing on that rock face that night. I don't know if it was something science hasn't documented yet or something else. All I know is that for those few moments, I felt like the natural order had shifted slightly, revealing something that existed just beyond the edges of what I understood about the world. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving home from a late shift at the hospital and the road stretches empty before me, I find myself checking the rocky slopes alongside the road, half expecting to see that silhouette again, watching and waiting with those bottomless black eyes. Story 2. This happened back in January, during that really bad cold snap we had. It was around 10 at night, and I needed to take my dog Rex out for his last bathroom break before bed. Rex is a German Shepherd mix, about 90 pounds, and he's never been afraid of anything. He's chased bears off our property twice, and once he even stood his ground against a mountain lion until I could get outside with my rifle. He's not a dog that spooks easily. That night was bitter cold, probably 15 degrees with a nasty wind. I bundled up in my heavy coat, grabbed Rex's leash, which I don't usually need, but it was so cold I didn't want him running off, and headed outside. The moon was nearly full, and we had that streetlight at the corner of our property, so visibility was actually pretty good despite being nighttime. Rex did his business near the front yard, and then he started sniffing around like he wanted to walk a bit more. I figured he needed to burn off some energy before bed, so I let him lead me toward the back of our property, where I have this old shed, about 100 feet from the house. That's when Rex's whole demeanor changed. He stopped dead in his tracks, and his ears went flat against his head, his tail tucked between his legs, and he started making this low whine I'd never heard from him before. I thought maybe there was a coyote or something near the shed, so I peered through the darkness. And there it was, standing about 20 feet away from us, near the corner of my outbuilding. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was huge, I mean massive, and standing completely upright. The streetlight was casting just enough illumination that I could make out its silhouette clearly. It was shaped like a man, but wrong. Too big, too bulky. My first thought was that some guy was trespassing on my property, but this was no man. No human being is that size. It had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall, with shoulders that must have been 5 feet across. The proportions were all wrong for a human, with extremely long arms that hung down past its knees. I froze completely. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think clearly. Rex was pulling on the leash now, not toward the creature, but back toward the house. My brave, fearless dog was trying to retreat. And that's when real fear started to sink in for me. Then the smell hit me. God, that smell. It was like a wet deer, but 10 times more intense. Musky, wild, and so strong it made my eyes water. It wasn't just body odor. It was something primeval and animal, but with a strange undertone I can't even describe. The creature and I just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Its face was mostly shadowed, but I could make out that it was covered in dark hair from head to toe. The hair looked matted in places, especially around what I assumed was its chest. Its body was powerfully built, not fat, but solid muscle. I'd guess it weighed at least 500 pounds, maybe more. Suddenly there was a noise off to my right, probably just a branch falling from a tree or something, and I instinctively turned my head toward the sound. When I did, the creature also turned to look in the same direction. That small movement broke the spell of terror that had been holding me in place. I noticed its posture change when we both looked back at each other. It shifted its weight forward slightly, and its arms moved away from its sides. I've spent enough time around aggressive animals to recognize a defensive stance when I see one. It was preparing to either charge or defend itself. I couldn't tell which, and I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I slowly started backing away, tugging gently on Rex's leash. Rex didn't need any encouragement. He was practically dragging me back toward the house. I kept my eyes on the creature the whole time, afraid that if I turned my back, it might charge. When we got about halfway to the house, I finally turned and ran, pulling Rex along with me. We burst through the back door, and I slammed it shut, locking it with trembling hands. My wife called from upstairs, asking if everything was okay. I couldn't even answer her properly, just yelled back that I thought there might be someone on our property. I grabbed my Glock from the gun safe and went to the window, peering out toward the shed. I couldn't see the creature anymore. Part of me wanted to just stay inside and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but another part of me, the stubborn part that's gotten me into trouble more than once, needed to know for sure. Against my better judgment, I went back outside, gun in hand. I stood on the back porch for a while, listening and watching. Nothing moved. That horrible smell was still in the air, though fainter now. I worked up the courage to walk about halfway to the shed, shining my flashlight around the area. The creature was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. No broken branches, no disturbed snow, apart from Rex's and my footprints. I searched the area for about 10 minutes before the cold forced me back inside. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, wondering if I'd imagined it all, but Rex's behavior told me it was real. He wouldn't leave my side all night, and he kept looking toward the windows and whining softly. Whatever we'd seen out there had scared my fearless dog, and that scared me more than anything. The next morning, as soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I went back out to check the area again. The snow had been disturbed around the shed in a way that didn't match human or any normal animal tracks, and then I found it, a single clear footprint in a patch of mud near the corner of the outbuilding where the roof's overhang had protected it from the snow. It was massive, about 20 inches long and 5 inches wide at the heel. It looked vaguely human-shaped, but with a wider ball of the foot and what looked like an opposable big toe. I took pictures with my phone, then tried to make a plaster cast like I'd seen people do on those Bigfoot hunting shows. I messed it up though. The plaster cracked when I tried to remove it. By the time I went back inside, I was shaking, not from the cold, but from the realization that I hadn't imagined anything. Whatever I'd seen was real, and it had been on my property, less than 100 feet from where my family slept. I've spent hours researching online since then. I've read about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. Some of the descriptions match exactly what I saw. The height, the build, the smell. Other details don't line up as well. But I know what I saw wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs or a man in a costume. This thing moved too naturally, and no human could have faked that size or that smell. I installed security cameras around our property the following week. I've been checking them obsessively ever since, but there's been no sign of the creature returning. Rex still gets nervous when we go out at night, though. He refuses to go near that shed after dark, and sometimes he'll stand at our back door and growl at nothing. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows, but I can tell she thinks I imagined it or exaggerated what I saw. A couple of close friends know, but they just joke about me joining the tinfoil hat club. That's why I'm writing this here. I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. I'm not claiming to have definitive proof of Bigfoot. I don't have a clear photo or video. The footprint pictures I took are convincing to me, but probably not to anyone else. All I have is what I experienced. A terrifying encounter with something I can't explain, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I've been taught about the natural world. I keep asking myself why it was there, so close to my home. Was it just passing through? Was it curious about us? Was it hungry? I've checked my property for any food sources that might attract something like that, garbage cans, compost piles, etc. But everything was secure that night. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of what I saw, but the way it looked at me. There was intelligence in that encounter. When we both turned to look at the same noise, it felt like I was sharing a moment with another thinking being, not just an animal. And when its posture changed, it felt deliberate, a communication of some kind. I've started carrying my gun whenever I go outside after dark. I've become hyper-aware of every sound in the woods surrounding our property. My wife says I'm getting paranoid, and maybe she's right, but she didn't see what I saw. She didn't feel the primal fear that washed over me when I realized I was being watched by something that shouldn't exist. I don't know if it will ever come back. Part of me hopes it doesn't, but another part of me wants proof, something concrete that would validate what I experienced. Until then, all I have is my story and the memory of those few terrifying moments when I came face to face with something that defies explanation. Story 3. I've owned my property for about 3 years now, and for the last 2, I've been trying to convince myself that there's a logical explanation for everything that's been happening here. I'm not the type who goes looking for the paranormal or jumps to conclusions about every little noise in the night. But at this point, I'm running out of explanations, and I need to get this off my chest. I live on about 15 acres that back up directly into dense, uninterrupted forest. When I bought the place, I fell in love with how secluded it felt while still being reasonably close to civilization. I've turned it into a small rescue farm with around 30 animals, some horses, goats, chickens, a few pigs, and some special needs animals that nobody else wanted. It's peaceful work most of the time, and I've always felt safe here, until things started getting weird. It started with little things. Feed bags that I was certain I'd sealed would be open in the morning. Storage containers left slightly ajar. Never anything dramatic. No destroyed containers or bags ripped to shreds like you'd expect from bears or raccoons. Just open, like something carefully opened them, took what it wanted, and tried to close them back. I initially blamed it on my own forgetfulness, or maybe some particularly clever raccoons. The property is cut through by power lines, creating this long, straight corridor through the woods where nobody can hunt or build. It's overgrown with blackberry brambles and thick vegetation, a perfect travel route for wildlife looking to move without being seen. I always figured it was just deer or maybe coyotes using that path. Last fall is when things started to get genuinely unsettling. The woods behind my house, the same woods my dogs absolutely love to explore during spring and summer, suddenly became off limits as far as my pets were concerned, and I mean completely. My German Shepherd, who normally charges into those trees like he owns them, would stop dead at the tree line, hackles raised, refusing to go a step further. My cats, who are outdoor, indoor, and usually impossible to keep track of, wouldn't go near that section of the property either. Around the same time, the sound started. I call it the peanut gallery, because that's what it sounds like, a weird collection of animal noises that come from the woods, especially at dusk. Owl hoots that don't quite sound like owls. Dog barks when there are no dogs around. Cat meows that sound almost right but just off. Sometimes there are these strange monkey-like chatters or odd howls that don't match anything native to this area. The thing is, they almost sound like imitations, like something is trying to recreate these sounds, but doesn't get them quite right. I remember sitting on my porch one evening last October, just having a cup of coffee and watching the sunset, when I heard what sounded like my neighbor's dog barking. Except my nearest neighbor is over a mile away, and the barking sounded like it was coming from just inside the tree line. Then it shifted to what sounded like a screech owl, then back to barking, then something that sounded almost like a person trying to mimic a coyote. The sounds would move too, starting in one spot and then, impossibly quickly, coming from somewhere else along the forest edge. The weirdest part? These sounds only happen in fall and winter. Come spring, they stop completely, and my animals go back to loving those woods like nothing ever happened. But the incident that really shook me happened about 6 months ago. I had some friends over for a bonfire. Just a small gathering, 5 of us total. We were sitting around the fire pit that overlooks one of my horse paddocks, drinking beers and catching up. It was around 9 at night, and we had some floodlights illuminating the field because I'd been telling them about a fox family I'd spotted there earlier in the week. We were all mid-conversation when my friend Jason suddenly went quiet, staring past the fire toward the field. Then my other friend Sarah gasped. I turned to look, and that's when I saw it, a tall, black figure running across the field on 2 legs. It was moving fast, way faster than a person should be able to run, and it had this wild, spiky, messy hair or fur that seemed to bounce as it moved. It was only visible for maybe 5 seconds before it disappeared into the trees on the far side of the paddock, but it was definitely bipedal and definitely not a person. The 3 of us who saw it just sat there in shocked silence. My other 2 friends, who had their backs to the field, kept asking what we'd seen. I remember mumbling something about a deer, but it wasn't a deer, not even close. Jason, who's an avid hunter, just kept saying, "That wasn't right. That wasn't anything I've ever seen before." After everyone left that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment in my head, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. A person in a costume. But who would be trespassing on my property at night? And how could they run that fast through an uneven field? A bear standing on its hind legs, but it moved too fluidly, and the proportions were all wrong. Besides, black bears aren't common in this specific part of the state. About a month after the bonfire incident, I was doing my evening chores, feeding the animals, checking fences, the usual routine, when I caught a scent that stopped me in my tracks. It was this powerful, musky animal smell, like wet dog mixed with something more pungent. I've been around farm animals all my life, and I'm familiar with pretty much every animal smell you can imagine, but this was different. It was overwhelming and seemed to hang in the air around the barn, even though I couldn't see anything unusual. The smell has come back several times since then, always at dusk, always near the edges of my property that border the deep woods. Sometimes it's accompanied by that feeling you get when you know you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stands up, and I get this primal urge to go inside and lock the doors. This past winter was when things really escalated. The peanut gallery sounds became more frequent and seemed to follow a pattern. They'd start at the northeast corner of my property, move along the tree line, and end up somewhere near the power line corridor. I started noticing broken branches high up in the trees along the edge of the woods, way higher than deer or even a person could reach, and the feed storage situation got worse. I'd find containers open several times a week, always the ones furthest from the house. One evening in January, I was bringing the horses in early because a storm was coming. It gets dark by 4:30 in the winter here, and I was hurrying to get everyone settled before the rain started. I was leading my oldest mare back to her stall when she suddenly planted her feet and refused to move, staring into the darkness beyond the barn. This is a horse that nothing spooks. She's been through floods and thunderstorms without batting an eye, but she was trembling from head to toe, nostrils flared. I turned to look where she was staring, and I swear I saw 2 reflective eyes watching us from the edge of the woods. Not low to the ground like a coyote or fox. These were tall, maybe 6 or 7 feet off the ground. They held steady for a few seconds, and then whatever it was moved away. making this strange shuffling noise as it went. I got the mare into her stall and hurried back to the house, that feeling of being watched intensifying with every step. Once inside, I grabbed my binoculars and looked out toward where I'd seen the eyes, but whatever it was had vanished. That night, the sounds were different. Instead of the usual imitation animal calls, there was what sounded like wood knocking against wood. 3 distinct knocks, a pause, then 3 more. This repeated for almost an hour before stopping abruptly. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud near where the feed is stored. They were large, much bigger than my boots, and shaped almost like a human foot, but wider and with what looked like claws or very long toes at the front. The stride length between them was huge, easily twice what mine would be. I took photos, but they came out blurry and inconclusive in the early morning light. Since then, I've been keeping a journal of every strange occurrence. The pattern is clear. Whatever this is, it's most active from October through March. During those months, my animals won't go near certain parts of the property. The strange sounds are frequent, and that feeling of being observed is constant. Then, like clockwork, everything stops in April, and life goes back to normal for the summer. Last week, it got cold early, an unseasonable cold snap for September, and I heard the peanut gallery start up again for the first time since spring. Same spot as always, same progression of almost but not quite right animal sounds. My dogs immediately refused to go into the backyard after dark. 2 nights ago, I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of something on my porch, not knocking or trying to get in, just moving around, shifting things. My porch swing was creaking rhythmically, like someone was sitting in it. I lay frozen in bed, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard heavy footsteps move down the steps and across the gravel driveway, then silence. In the morning, I found my work boots, which I'd left by the door, neatly placed side by side in the middle of the porch. The feed container I keep there for the barn cats was open, completely emptied of kibble. I don't know what to do. I love my property and my animals, and I don't want to leave. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever is out there is getting bolder. It's watching me, learning my routines, maybe even trying to communicate in its way. Part of me wants to set up cameras, but another part is terrified of what I might see. Would having proof make this better or worse? All I know is that fall is here again, and I'm dreading the long, dark winter ahead. Something lives in my woods, something that walks on 2 legs, makes impossible sounds, and smells like nothing that should exist in these parts. And I think it's getting curious about me. Story 4. I still can't explain what happened that summer night when I was 12. It's been over 20 years, and I've never talked about it outside of the few people who were there. I guess I'm finally sharing it because I need to know if anyone else has experienced something similar. My parents owned about 40 acres of land that backed up to Bear Creek. It was mostly wooded, with thick brush and tall trees that got denser as you approached the creek. The property sloped downward toward the water, creating this natural bowl shape. In summer, parts of the land that weren't wooded would grow these fields of tall grass. I'm talking chest high on a 12-year-old. That particular night, me and 3 friends had permission to camp out on the property. We had this spot we always used, about a quarter mile from the house, where there was a small clearing, perfect for tents and a campfire. My parents were cool with us camping there since it was still on their land, and they knew we weren't going to get into any real trouble. We'd spent most of the day swimming in the creek, building up our campsite, and just messing around like kids do. As the sun started setting, we got a decent fire going and broke out the hot dogs and marshmallows. Looking back, it was just an ordinary summer night. Warm, slightly humid, with those constant cricket and frog sounds from the creek. It must have been around 10 o'clock when Jake, the youngest kid in our group, decided he'd had enough and wanted to head back to my parents' house. He lived next door and was supposed to call his mom from our landline when he was ready to go home. "I'm heading back," he announced, standing up and dusting off his shorts. Me and Chris, another friend, started teasing him about being scared of the dark. We were at that age where you'd rather die than admit you were afraid of anything. "Watch out for the boogeyman," Chris called after him, and I joined in with some stupid joke about monsters in the woods. Jake flipped us off and started walking through the tall grass field toward the path that led back to the house. It was pretty dark by then, with just the moonlight and our campfire providing any light. Chris grabbed his flashlight, one of those heavy metal ones that took like 4D batteries, and started shining it at Jake's back as he walked away. I grabbed my flashlight too, and we were both lighting up the path ahead of Jake, partly to help him see and partly to keep teasing him. The tall grass was swaying slightly in the breeze, creating these moving shadows that looked kind of creepy in the flashlight beams. That's when I saw it. About 20 yards beyond Jake, moving in the opposite direction through the tall grass, there was something. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just shadows from the grass or a deer, but this was bigger, much bigger. I only caught glimpses of it through gaps in the grass, but what I saw made my blood run cold. Whatever this thing was, it stood at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe more. It wasn't moving like a person running or walking. It had this strange, fluid movement, these long, smooth strides that seemed almost effortless, like it was gliding more than stepping. But the weirdest part was how it stayed low to the ground despite its height, with bent knees and slouched shoulders like it was trying to stay hidden. In the dim light from our flashlights, it looked grayish, almost like a shadow itself. And from what little I could make out, it seemed to be covered in fur or hair, not like a costume, but like that was its skin. I froze completely. The flashlight in my hand started shaking, and I couldn't even call out a warning to Jake. My throat just closed up. I glanced at Chris, whose flashlight beam had also stopped moving. His eyes were wide, mouth hanging open. He'd seen it too. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining things. "Did you?" He started to whisper, but I just nodded frantically. Finally finding my voice, I yelled out to Jake, "Jake, come back right now!" There must have been something in my voice, real fear, because Jake didn't argue. He turned around and started jogging back toward us. What is it?" he asked as he reached our campfire. "There's something out there," Chris said, his voice shaking. "Something big." Jake looked at us like we were trying to prank him. "Yeah, right. Nice try, guys." "We're not messing with you," I insisted, still scanning the grass with my flashlight. We both saw it. It was huge, like not human. Our fourth friend, Matt, who'd been quiet up to this point, stood up and grabbed his own flashlight. "What did you see?" he asked seriously. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but it sounded crazy even as I said it. It was tall, taller than any person I know, and it moved weird, like hunched over but fast, and I think it was covered in hair. "Bullshit," Jake said, but he wasn't laughing anymore. He could tell we weren't joking. For the next hour, we all sat huddled around the campfire, scanning the surrounding woods and grass with our flashlights. No one wanted to admit they were scared, but none of us suggested going to sleep either. We kept the fire built up high, adding way more logs than we needed just to keep the area around us as bright as possible. "Maybe it was a bear," Matt suggested at one point. I shook my head. Bears don't walk on two legs like that, and it was too tall. "A person in a costume?" Jake offered. "Out here, in the middle of nowhere? Who would be wearing a costume in these woods at night?" Chris countered. We kept coming up with explanations, each one less convincing than the last. A tall hunter, someone playing a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. Whatever I'd seen moved in a way that wasn't natural, wasn't human. None of us slept that night. We stayed up until dawn, keeping the fire going, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle in the grass. We didn't see the thing again, but I felt like it was still out there, watching us from the trees. When the first light of morning finally came, I felt this immense relief wash over me. Somehow the idea of this thing being out there seemed less terrifying in daylight. "I'm going to look for tracks," I announced after we'd packed up most of our stuff. "I'll come with you," Chris said quickly. I think neither of us wanted to go alone. We headed out to the area where we'd seen the thing moving through the grass. In the daylight, it looked so normal, so unthreatening. Just a field of tall grass swaying in the morning breeze. We spent nearly an hour combing through that section of the field, looking for footprints, broken grass stems, anything that might prove something large had moved through there. But there was nothing. The ground looked completely untouched, as if whatever we'd seen hadn't even been there. No footprints, no disturbed soil, not even flattened grass. It was like it had moved through the area without actually touching anything. "Maybe we imagined it," Chris said finally, but I could tell he didn't believe that any more than I did. When we got back to the campsite, Jake and Matt had finished packing everything up. No one mentioned what had happened as we hiked back to my parents' house. It was like we all silently agreed that talking about it would make it more real somehow. I spent the rest of that summer avoiding the woods near Bear Creek after dark. When my friends and I did camp out again, we stayed much closer to the house. We never directly talked about what we saw that night, but sometimes I'd catch Chris scanning the tree line at dusk, and I knew he was thinking about it too. The thing that still bothers me most all these years later is the way it moved. Human beings don't move like that. That strange, fluid motion, staying low to the ground despite being so tall, and the absence of any evidence the next morning. How does something that size move through tall grass without leaving a single trace? I've looked into local legends since then, read about various cryptids and unexplained phenomena. Some descriptions of Bigfoot or Sasquatch come close to what we saw, but not quite. This thing seemed different somehow, more deliberate in its movements, more aware. Sometimes I wonder if it knew we had spotted it, if it had been watching us for a while before we noticed it, if it had been watching Jake as he walked alone through that field. I still visit my parents' property occasionally. The creek is still there, the woods still thick and wild. Sometimes I stand at the edge of that field where the tall grass grows in summer, and I stare into the trees beyond. I've never seen anything like that night again, but I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, moving through those woods in that strange, unnatural way. Something that doesn't want to be seen, something that knows how to move without leaving a trace. And the worst part, I'm not entirely sure it stayed in those woods. Sometimes, on dark nights when I'm alone, I get this creeping sensation that it followed me somehow, that it's out there, watching, waiting, and I have no idea what it wants. Ondiste tidu sin. Story 5. I still get chills thinking about what happened at Clark Fork Campground. This was September 2001, just a week after the 9/11 attacks. My wife and I decided to go camping to clear our heads after everything that had happened. The whole country was in shock, and we thought being out in nature might help us process it all. When we got to Clark Fork, the first thing that struck me was how empty it was. I mean, it's not usually packed this time of year, but there were barely any campers around. The ranger at the entrance seemed surprised to see us. He checked us in and assigned us a spot in B Loop. As we were setting up our tent, he came by again and told us we'd have to move to A Loop the next day because they were closing B Loop for the season. Not a big deal, just a minor inconvenience. We spent the day hiking and exploring. The area is beautiful. Dense forest, the river nearby, mountains in the distance. It was exactly what we needed after watching the news non-stop for days. That night was quiet, just the usual forest sounds. We made dinner on our little camp stove, played some cards, and turned in early. The next morning we packed up and moved to A Loop, as instructed. The new site was fine, similar to the one we had before, but the weird thing was how empty the campground felt. I think there were only 2 other sites occupied in the entire A Loop. One had an older couple with an RV. and the other had what looked like a father and son with fishing gear. Everyone else was gone. I remember joking with my wife that we practically had the place to ourselves. More nature for us, she said. We didn't think much of it at the time. The emptiness seemed peaceful rather than eerie. We spent the second day fishing and hiking again. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. September in Montana is really something special. We made a campfire that night, roasted some marshmallows, talked about normal stuff. It felt good to disconnect from the world for a bit. We went to bed around 10. I remember checking my watch before turning off our lantern. The tent was comfortable enough. We had good sleeping bags and those little inflatable mats that make sleeping on the ground bearable. I fell asleep pretty quickly, listening to the sound of the wind in the trees. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when I first woke up. My watch said it was around 2 in the morning. Something had disturbed my sleep, but I wasn't sure what. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. At first, it was distant, a high-pitched sound coming from somewhere in the forest. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. Not a wolf or a coyote howling, not an elk bugling. This was different. It was a scream. I propped myself up on my elbow, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the Clark Fork River, north of the access road. My wife stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah," I said. "What the hell is that?" The sound came again, even louder and sharper. It was a continuous scream that went on for maybe 15 seconds before stopping abruptly, then silence for a few seconds, and it would start again. "It sounds like..." My wife hesitated. "It sounds like a man being murdered in the forest." That's exactly what it sounded like, human pain and terror. But there was something off about it too, something that didn't sound quite right, not entirely human. The pitch was too high, too consistent. There was no gasping or variation you'd expect from a person in pain, just this continuous, piercing scream. We lay there in the darkness of our tent, listening as the screaming continued. It went on for what must have been 5 minutes straight, though it felt much longer. Sometimes it would pause for a few seconds, but then start right back up again, always from the same direction, always with that same unnatural quality. "Should we do something?" my wife asked. "Maybe someone's hurt." I thought about it. We had a flashlight and my hunting knife, but the idea of walking into the dark forest toward that sound made my skin crawl. It didn't feel right. Everything in my body was telling me to stay put. "If someone was really being attacked, they wouldn't scream like that," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "It has to be an animal, maybe a cougar or something." But I'd heard cougars before, and they didn't sound like this. This was different. The screaming finally stopped, and the forest went quiet again. Too quiet. No crickets, no rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. We lay there for a long time, listening, but the screaming didn't come back. Eventually, my wife fell back asleep, but I couldn't. I kept staring at the roof of the tent, watching the shadows of tree branches move in the moonlight, waiting for the sound to return. About an hour later, when I had almost convinced myself it was just some strange animal I'd never heard before, I heard something else. A metallic clang, followed by a heavy thud. It sounded like one of the bear-proof dumpsters, the kind with the heavy lids that you have to lift with both hands. The sound came from the direction of the closed B-loop. I sat up straight, fully alert now. Bears can't open those dumpsters. That's the whole point of them. And there weren't supposed to be any people over in B-loop. The ranger had been clear about that. I considered waking my wife, but decided against it. She had finally fallen back to sleep, and I didn't want to scare her more. Instead, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and poked my head out. The campground was bathed in moonlight. I could see the outlines of the few other tents and the RV. Nothing seemed to be moving. I strained my eyes in the direction of B-loop, but it was too far away and too dark to see anything. The sound came again, the unmistakable noise of a dumpster lid being lifted and then dropped. Someone, or something, was definitely over there. I pulled on my boots without lacing them and grabbed our flashlight. Standing outside the tent, I listened for any other sounds. The forest was still unnaturally quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing. I thought about walking over to B Loop to investigate, but something stopped me, a feeling in my gut that said going toward that sound was a very, very bad idea. I've been an outdoorsman all my life, and I've learned to trust that feeling. It's kept me from stumbling into bear dens and stepping on rattlesnakes more than once. So I stood there, flashlight in hand, listening. After a few minutes with no more sounds, I went back into the tent and lay down. I don't think I slept at all for the rest of the night. I just lay there waiting for morning, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. In the daylight, the forest didn't seem so threatening. My wife woke up and we talked about what had happened. She remembered the screaming but had slept through the dumpster sounds. Maybe we should check it out, she suggested as we made breakfast. See if there's anything over in B Loop. I wasn't keen on the idea, but in the daylight it seemed silly to be so scared. So after we ate, we walked over to the closed section of the campground. The dumpsters were there, their lids firmly closed. There was no sign that anyone had been there during the night. No footprints, no trash, nothing. See? Probably just the wind, my wife said, but I could tell she didn't believe it any more than I did. There had been no wind that night. We decided to stay one more night. In retrospect, that was probably a mistake, but we had paid for 2 nights, and we didn't want to let whatever had happened spook us into leaving early. We spent the day hiking along the river, deliberately avoiding the area where the screaming had come from. Every time we heard a twig snap or a rustle in the bushes, both of us would freeze and look around. We got back to our campsite around 4 in the afternoon. I was setting up the stove to make dinner when it happened. There was a crashing sound from the direction of the closed B Loop, and suddenly a large deer burst into our campsite. It was running at full speed, its eyes wide with panic. It tore right through the middle of our site, nearly knocking over our tent, and disappeared into the forest on the other side. My wife and I just stood there, shocked. The deer had been terrified of something, and the weird thing was, there was plenty of open space around our campsite where it could have gone. It didn't need to run right through us unless it was in a blind panic. What was it running from? My wife asked, staring in the direction of B Loop. I didn't know, but I had a sinking feeling it might be connected to the screaming we'd heard the night before. We debated packing up and leaving right then, but it was getting late, and the nearest town was over an hour's drive away. In the end, we decided to stay the night, but agreed to leave first thing in the morning. That night, we didn't even try to have a campfire. We ate a quick dinner, secured our food in the bear box, and retreated to our tent before it was fully dark. Neither of us said it, but we were both scared. I don't think either of us slept much that night. We lay in the tent, listening to every sound in the forest. The strange thing was, there weren't many sounds to hear. It was that same unnatural silence from the night before. No insects, no nocturnal animals moving around. Just silence. We didn't hear the screaming again, and there were no more sounds from the dumpsters. But around 3 in the morning, I heard something else. Footsteps, heavy footsteps moving slowly through the forest, circling our campsite. I nudged my wife and she nodded. She heard it too. We lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as whatever it was moved around out there. It never came too close to the tent, but it was definitely there, moving in a wide circle around us. The footsteps eventually faded away, and we didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. As soon as it was light enough to see, we packed up and left. We didn't bother with breakfast or even coffee. We just wanted to get out of there. As we were driving away, I looked in the rearview mirror at the campground receding behind us. For a split second, I thought I saw something large moving between the trees at the edge of B Loop. but it was far away, and we were moving fast, so I can't be sure. We never went back to Clark Fork Campground after that. I've tried to find logical explanations for what we experienced. Maybe the screaming was just some animal I'd never heard before. Maybe the dumpster sounds were just the metal contracting in the cold night air. Maybe the deer was running from a normal predator. But deep down, I know it was something else. Something that doesn't fit into the neat categories of what should exist in those Montana forests. Whatever it was watching us that night, circling our tent, waiting. Story 6. I'm still shaken up writing this. It was supposed to be a normal hunting trip, but what happened out there, I can't explain it. My mind keeps circling back to it. This happened 2 years ago during bow season in September. My family has hunted together for years. Me, my dad, my brother Jake, and my sister Rachel. We'd scored permission to hunt a nice piece of private land between Douglas Mountain and the Little Snake River near Greystone, Colorado. It's beautiful country, lots of elk, and we were excited to try this new spot. Dad had scouted it a few weeks earlier and was convinced it would be productive. The landowner had mentioned there were several bulls moving through the area, and we were eager to fill our freezer for the year. We got to the property around noon. It was a perfect Colorado fall day. Clear blue sky, probably around 65 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep cool while hiking. The property was mostly open meadows, broken up by stands of pinyon and cedar, with deep draws cutting down to the Little Snake River. You could see for miles across the valleys and ridges. The plan was pretty simple. Jake and Rachel would hike up to a ridge that overlooked a main game trail, while Dad and I would stay with the truck at a lower elevation where we could glass the hillsides. We'd all keep in radio contact. After getting our gear ready, Jake and Rachel headed up the hill. They were probably about 300 yards above us, positioned with a good view of several trails that the elk used when moving between feeding and bedding areas. Dad and I set up our spotting scope on the hood of the truck and started scanning the hillsides. Everything was normal for the first couple of hours. We saw a few mule deer in the distance, but no elk. Around 3 in the afternoon, Dad suggested we try some calling to see if we could locate any bulls in the area. Rut was just starting, and sometimes you can get them to respond even in the middle of the day. Dad pulled out his bugle and did a few calls, that high-pitched whistle that rises into a bugle sound that elk bulls make during rut. We waited a few minutes, then he called again. Jake radioed down that they hadn't seen anything move in response. So Dad tried once more, a bit louder this time. That's when everything changed. About 30 seconds after Dad's last call, we heard a response from the canyon to our west, but it wasn't an elk. I've heard elk my whole life, and this was wrong. It started like an elk bugle, but then transformed into this drawn-out howl that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was impossibly loud and carried across the entire canyon. The sound had an almost human quality to it, like someone who had never heard an elk was trying to imitate one, but with this powerful, deep resonance no human could produce. Dad and I looked at each other, and I could see he was confused too. "What the hell was that?" I asked. "Not sure," he said, but his eyes were scanning the tree line. Maybe a weird echo or something. We stood there for maybe a minute, straining to hear anything else. Then it came again, that same bizarre howl, but closer this time. It seemed to be moving toward us from the dense stand of trees to the northwest. The sound wasn't right, too sustained, too powerful, and with this weird modulation that felt deliberate, not like any natural animal vocalization I'd ever heard. Dad grabbed the radio. "Jake, Rachel, you guys hear that?" "Yeah." Jake's voice crackled back, sounding tense. "What is it?" "Not sure. Keep your eyes open up there." Dad decided to check it out. He grabbed his binoculars and walked about 50 yards toward the edge of the tree line. I stayed by the truck, watching him through the spotting scope. He was scanning the trees, moving slowly, when suddenly he froze. Through the scope, I could see his posture change. His whole body went rigid. Then it came again, that howl, louder this time and definitely closer. It started with that poor imitation of an elk bugle and then transformed into something that sounded almost angry. It echoed across the canyon, and I swear I could feel the sound in my chest. Dad turned and walked quickly back to the truck. His face was pale and he was moving with purpose, not quite running, but definitely not taking his time. "What did you see?" I asked as he reached me. He shook his head. "Not sure. Something moved in those trees. Big, dark brown. Just caught a glimpse of it." "Bear," I suggested. "No," he said firmly. "Moved different. And that sound. That's no bear." He tried to sound calm, but I've known my dad my whole life. He's been hunting since he was a kid. He's encountered bears, mountain lions, and all kinds of wildlife. I'd never seen him rattled like this. The radio crackled, and Rachel's voice came through. "Dad, there's something moving through the trees below us. We can't see it clearly, but it's big." "Stay put," Dad replied. "We're calling Jake and Rachel back down. I don't like this." We radioed Jake and Rachel to pack up and head back to the truck. While waiting, Dad and I stood in uneasy silence, both of us scanning the tree line. The woods suddenly seemed different, darker, more threatening. I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. Then the howling started again. This time it was a series of calls, one after another, moving parallel to the hill where Jake and Rachel were descending. It sounded like it was pacing them. "Dad," I said quietly, "what the hell is that?" He shook his head. "I don't know, but we're leaving as soon as they get here." The next 15 minutes were the longest of my life. We could hear that thing calling every few minutes, and each time it sounded like it was in a different location, circling around the area between us and Jake and Rachel. The calls weren't even trying to sound like elk anymore. They were these long, powerful howls that seemed to carry for miles. Finally, we saw Jake and Rachel coming down the trail. They were moving fast, almost jogging. When they reached us, Rachel's face was flushed, and Jake looked over his shoulder every few steps. "You guys okay?" Dad asked. "What the hell is making that noise?" Jake demanded. It followed us halfway down the hill. "Did you see anything?" I asked. Rachel shook her head. "Just movement. Something big moving through the trees. But we could hear it. It was close, maybe 50 yards away at one point." We all piled into the truck. As Dad started the engine, that howl came again, closer than ever. It sounded like it was right at the edge of the trees now, maybe 100 yards from us. "Anyone recognize that sound?" Dad asked as he put the truck in gear. "Any of you ever heard anything like that before?" We all shook our heads. I've been in those mountains my whole life. I've heard every animal that lives there. Elk, deer, moose, bears, coyotes, wolves, mountain lions. This wasn't any of those. It had elements that sounded vaguely familiar, but combined in a way that was just wrong. As we drove down the access road, Jake described what they'd experienced on the hill. They'd been set up watching the game trails when Dad started calling. After that strange response, they'd noticed movement in the trees below their position. Whatever it was moving from tree to tree, staying just inside the tree line where visibility was poor. They never got a clear look, just glimpses of something large and dark brown. "It knew we were there," Rachel said quietly. "It was smart. It stayed where we couldn't see it clearly, but it was watching us. I could feel it watching us the whole time." We drove in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. About halfway back to the main road, Dad spoke up. "I saw fur," he said. "When I was at the edge of the trees, something moved, and I caught a glimpse of dark brown fur through a gap in the branches, too tall for a bear, moved too smoothly. For a second I thought it might be a person in a ghillie suit, but no, the way it moved wasn't human." We didn't talk much on the drive home. We were all trying to rationalize what had happened, fit it into our understanding of the world, Maybe it was a bear with some kind of respiratory issue that affected its vocalization. Maybe it was people messing with us, though that seemed unlikely on private property miles from anywhere. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that howl in my head. I got up and started searching online for animal sounds. I listened to every recording of elk, wolves, coyotes, bears. Nothing matched. Then on a whim, I typed "unexplained howls in mountains" into the search bar. That led me down a rabbit hole of Bigfoot research websites. I was skeptical, I still am. But then I found recordings of what these researchers claimed were Sasquatch vocalizations. My blood ran cold. The similarities were undeniable. The same powerful resonant quality, the same strange modulations, the same feeling of intelligence behind the sound. I showed the recordings to my family the next day. We all agreed. It was eerily similar to what we'd heard. We never went back to that property. Dad called the landowner to thank him, but made an excuse about why we wouldn't be returning. A few weeks later, Dad ran into a Forest Service guy he knows at the gas station. When Dad mentioned where we'd been hunting, the guy got quiet. Then he told Dad that another hunter had reported seeing what he described as a large, hairy figure on a trail in that same area just a week before our experience. I don't know what was out there that day. I don't know if I believe in Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it, but I know what I heard, what we all heard. And I know that whatever made that sound was intelligent, powerful, and didn't want us there. 2 years later, I still get uneasy when I'm in the woods and the light starts to fade. I still find myself scanning the trees, listening for that sound. Sometimes I wake up in the night, my heart racing, convinced I've heard it again. That powerful, unnatural howl echoing across the canyon. And story 7. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened last Tuesday morning. I've always been the skeptical type. The person who rolls their eyes at ghost stories and cryptid sightings. But after what I saw on my way to work, I don't know what to believe anymore. I work at a manufacturing plant about 30 miles from my house, and my shift starts at 6 in the morning. That means I leave home around 5, when it's still pitch black outside, especially now in October. The drive takes me through some pretty remote areas, mostly forests and farmland, with the occasional cluster of houses. It's usually uneventful. Sometimes I see deer or foxes crossing the road, but that Tuesday was different. It was around 5:20 in the morning, still completely dark outside. I was driving down County Road 16, a 2-lane road that cuts through a dense wooded area for about 7 miles. No streetlights, just my headlights illuminating maybe 50 feet ahead of me. I was going about 50 miles per hour, sipping my coffee, half listening to some early morning radio talk show. About 3 miles down this stretch, my headlights caught something up ahead on the road. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a garbage bag blown into the road. As I got closer, I realized it was something low to the ground and dark. My first thought was bear. We get black bears in this area sometimes, though they're not super common. I tapped my brakes, slowing down to maybe 40 miles per hour, but I was also kind of curious to get a better look. I mean, how often do you see a bear, right? So I pressed the gas pedal slightly to close the distance faster, thinking the headlights would give me a better view before the animal wandered back into the woods. That's when everything went weird. As soon as I accelerated, this thing took off running. Not away from the road like you'd expect from a startled animal, but straight down the road in the same direction I was driving. The movement was so sudden and deliberate that I instinctively hit the brakes again, dropping my speed to maybe 30 miles per hour. My headlights now fully illuminated whatever was running ahead of me, and I realized immediately this was definitely not a bear. Not even close. It was upright, completely upright on 2 legs, running. And not in that awkward way that bears sometimes stand up and stumble forward. This thing was running smoothly, with purpose, with a controlled gait that looked practiced and efficient. The creature was covered in dark fur. Not black exactly, more like a very dark brown that absorbed the light. But what really caught my attention were two lighter patches on its body. There was this horizontal band, maybe 3 or 4 inches wide, just below where its shoulder blades would be, kind of like a stripe across its upper back. And there was another similar-sized lighter patch across its rear end, right at the base of the spine. The patches weren't white, more like a lighter brown or tan color that stood out against the darker fur. I was now following this thing down the road, maintaining about the same distance, maybe 30 feet behind it. It never looked back at me, not once. Just kept running straight ahead. I'm not sure how fast it was going, maybe 15 or 20 miles per hour. Fast enough that I needed to keep driving to keep up, but not so fast that it was outrunning my vehicle. The way it moved was unsettling, smooth, controlled. Its arms, and they were definitely arms, not front legs, swung in a natural motion, but not exactly like a human's would. They were longer, and the swing had a different rhythm to it. Its head was set forward on its shoulders, not perfectly upright like a person's. After running for maybe 100 feet down the middle of the road, the creature suddenly veered left, a sharp, decisive turn. It went down into the drainage ditch beside the road and then up the embankment on the other side in one fluid motion. There was no hesitation, no stumbling, no slowing down to navigate the uneven terrain. It moved like it had done this 1,000 times before, like the darkness and rough ground were nothing to it. I slowed my car almost to a stop and watched as it disappeared into the brush and trees beyond the embankment. The whole sighting lasted maybe 15 or 20 seconds, but it's burned into my memory like it was hours. I sat there idling for a minute, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding, and I had this weird cold sweat breaking out all over my body. My coffee had spilled when I hit the brakes, and I could feel it soaking into my jeans, but I didn't even care. What the hell had I just seen? I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head since then. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. No one could move like that in a suit, especially not at that speed and with that agility. The proportions were wrong for a human anyway. The arms too long, the shoulders too broad, the head shaped differently. The thing that keeps sticking with me is how efficiently it moved in such low light. I had my bright headlights on, and even I couldn't see the details of the ditch or embankment clearly. But this creature navigated it at full speed, without even a moment's hesitation or uncertainty, like it could see perfectly in the dark, or like it knew the terrain by heart. And it never looked back at me, not once. Most animals, when startled by a vehicle, will at least glance back to gauge the threat. This thing just focused forward, like it had a destination in mind, and I was just an inconvenience it needed to avoid. I was late to work that day. I just sat in my car for maybe 10 minutes after it disappeared, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. When I finally drove on, I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see it again. But there was nothing. I didn't tell anyone at work. What would I say? Hey, I think I saw Bigfoot on my way in this morning. I'd never hear the end of it. My co-workers already think I'm a bit odd since I keep to myself. Telling them I saw some unidentified furry creature running on 2 legs would just confirm I'm the weirdo they suspect me to be. That night, I went down the internet rabbit hole, looked up Bigfoot sightings in my area. There have been a few over the years, mostly in the state forest, about 20 miles from where I had my encounter. None of the descriptions mentioned the lighter patches of fur I saw, though. Most just described a tall, dark, hairy humanoid figure, less specific than what I'd observed. I went back to that spot the next morning, left extra early so I'd have time to stop and look around. In the daylight, it looked so ordinary, just a rural road cutting through the woods. The ditch was there, about 3 feet deep, and the embankment on the other side rose maybe 4 feet up from the bottom of the ditch. Beyond that was thick undergrowth and trees. I looked for tracks, broken branches, any sign that something had passed through, but I couldn't find anything definitive. The ground was pretty hard from lack of rain, and the undergrowth was too dense to show a clear path. It's been 5 days now, and I've taken the same route to work each morning, driving a little slower past that spot, watching carefully. Nothing. Part of me hopes I see it again, so I can confirm I'm not losing my mind. Another part of me is terrified of exactly that. I've always been a logical person. I work with machines, things that make sense, that follow rules and patterns. If something breaks, there's always a reason. A worn part, a loose connection, something tangible and fixable. But there's no logical explanation for what I saw, no way to categorize it within my understanding of the world. Before this, if someone had told me they'd seen Bigfoot, I'd have nodded politely while mentally filing them under crazy or attention seeker. Now I find myself on the other side. I saw something real, something that moved with purpose and intelligence, something that, according to everything I've been taught to believe, shouldn't exist. The most unsettling part? If these creatures are out there, how many times have they seen us without us noticing them? The way this thing moved through the darkness, how easily it navigated difficult terrain. It was built for stealth, for remaining unseen. I only spotted it because it was on the road, directly in my headlights. If it had been even 10 feet into the woods, I would have driven right past, completely unaware. I keep thinking about its gait. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I've seen either. It was natural, fluid, like it was perfectly designed to run upright, not awkward or forced the way it looks when a bear stands on its hind legs. This was its normal way of moving. I've been sleeping poorly since Tuesday. Keep waking up thinking I hear something outside my window. My house backs up to a small wooded area, nothing extensive, just a few acres of trees before the next subdivision starts. But now I find myself staring out at those trees, wondering what might be looking back. I don't know what to do with this experience. I can't just forget it happened. It's changed how I see the world, changed what I believe is possible. I'm not religious, but this almost feels like some kind of revelation, a peek behind the curtain at something that exists beyond our everyday understanding. I haven't told anyone except you folks reading this. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I wouldn't have believed me a week ago, but I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't anything I can explain away with rational thinking. There was something out there, on that dark road, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. Something that, for a brief moment, shared its world with mine before disappearing back into the shadows where it belongs. And I can't stop wondering if I'll ever see it again, or worse, if it's seen me since, watching from just beyond the tree line while I remain oblivious to its presence. Story 8. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. I'm a practical man. I've farmed apples in Yakima Valley, Washington for 23 years, and until September of 2011, the strangest thing I'd ever seen on my property was a moose that wandered in from God knows where. It started with missing apples. Not a big deal at first. I figured we had deer coming through, but then I noticed something odd about where the fruit was disappearing from. These weren't low-hanging apples being taken. These were from high up, 15 feet off the ground in some cases, and the branches were broken in weird ways, snapped downward, like something had pulled on them with force. My first thought was bears. We get black bears around here sometimes. But there were no claw marks on the trees, no scat, no other signs. Whatever was taking my apples wasn't following the usual pattern. I didn't think much of it until one night in mid-September. It had been a long day. One of my gates on the far side of the property had broken, and I'd spent the evening fixing it. It was probably around 10:30 at night when I was walking back toward the house. The moon was bright enough that I could see my way, but I had my flashlight with me anyway. I was cutting through the northeast section of the orchard, the Honeycrisp block, which was just starting to come into peak ripeness. I remember I was dead tired, thinking about the shower I was going to take and the beer waiting in the fridge, when I heard a strange sound. It wasn't like any animal noise I recognized, sort of a low, rumbling grunt. I stopped walking. My first instinct was to shine my flashlight toward the sound, but something made me hesitate. My heart started beating faster. I turned the light off and moved slowly, quietly, toward the edge of the row where I could look across the open space between sections. The moonlight was enough to see shapes, but not details. Something was moving between the trees about 60 yards away. Something big. I stood completely still, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. After my eyes adjusted better, I could tell there wasn't just one shape moving around. There were three. I slowly raised my flashlight, took a deep breath and switched it on. I still struggled to describe what I saw. The beam caught the largest one first. It was, I'm going to call it a he, because there was no mistaking its gender. It was a male Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, but I know what I saw. He was enormous, well over 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9. His shoulders were unbelievably wide, like an NFL linebacker ×2. He was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but hair that hung in uneven patches, with some lighter colored areas on his chest and face. His arms were long, hanging almost to his knees. Standing beside him was a female. She was smaller but still massive by human standards, probably 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall. Her hair was a shade lighter and she moved differently, more graceful somehow. And then I saw the little one, a juvenile, barely half the size of the female. It moved quickly between the trees, more energetic and playful. They didn't see me at first. I was frozen in place, the flashlight beam held steady by pure shock. They were eating my apples. The male was reaching up and pulling apples directly off branches that would be impossible for a human to reach without a ladder. The female was more selective, carefully examining each piece of fruit before picking it. Sometimes she would hand one down to the little one, who would take it eagerly. The juvenile was climbing on the lower branches of the trees, swinging and pulling itself up to reach fruit, then dropping back down. It moved with an agility that seemed impossible for something that size. They made noises to each other, not words, nothing I'd call language exactly, but definitely communication. Low rumbling sounds from the male, shorter, higher-pitched noises from the female. The little one made quick chirping sounds that reminded me of a chimpanzee, but deeper. I don't know how long I stood there watching them. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5. Time felt suspended. I couldn't move, couldn't even think about running or calling out. I just stared, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Then something changed. The male stopped suddenly and raised his head. He sniffed the air in long, deliberate inhales. Then he turned and looked directly at me. I'll never forget his face. My flashlight beam was square on him, illuminating features that were both familiar and alien. He had a heavy brow ridge that shadowed deep-set eyes. His nose was wide and flat. His mouth was broader than a human's, with visible teeth that looked square and strong. But it was his eyes that struck me the most. Dark, intelligent, and completely aware. He knew I was watching him. He knew I didn't belong. The female made a sharp grunt that made me jump. The juvenile immediately darted behind her legs, peeking out around them. She put one massive hand on its head, a gesture so recognizably protective that it sent chills through me. The male took a step forward. I should have run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn and sprint back to the house. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground. He made a sound then, a deep, resonant rumble that I didn't just hear. I felt it in my chest. It vibrated through the whole orchard. It wasn't exactly aggressive, but it was assertive. A warning maybe, or a statement of territory. I don't know. What I do know is that he could have charged me if he wanted to. He could have covered the distance between us in seconds, but he didn't. He stood there, massive and powerful, just assessing me. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. I was trembling so hard I'm surprised I could hold the flashlight steady. Finally, he reached up without breaking eye contact, grabbed one more apple from a branch, and then slowly, deliberately turned away. The three of them retreated into the trees, the male first, then the female with a hand on the juvenile's back, guiding it along. They didn't run, they just walked away with a dignity that's hard to explain. I watched until they disappeared into the darkness beyond my orchard. I don't remember walking back to the house. I just remember suddenly being in my kitchen, a glass of whiskey in my hand instead of the beer I'd planned on, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face staring back at me. Those eyes, that awareness. When dawn came, I went back to the orchard. The dew was still fresh on the grass, and in the soft ground near the trees where they'd been feeding, I found impressions. Not footprints exactly. The ground was too firm for clear impressions, but depressions where something very heavy had stood. Near one tree, I found what looked like knuckle marks in the dirt, as if one of them had rested a hand on the ground. And the apples. They were gone from branches as high as 18 feet up. No human could have reached them without equipment. No bear could have picked them so selectively. I've thought about reporting what I saw. I've thought about calling researchers or setting up cameras, but I haven't done any of that. I'm not sure why. Maybe because my orchard feels different now. It's like they've made it partly theirs, and I'm just the caretaker. They've come back several times since then, always at night, always when I'm not around. I know because I find the signs. Apples missing from impossible heights, branches bent in specific ways. Once I found a stack of apple cores neatly piled at the base of a tree, as if they were being thoughtful about their mess. I still don't know what to make of what I saw that night. I know what Bigfoot is supposed to be. A myth, a legend, something people claim to see but can never prove. I know how crazy this all sounds. Before this happened, I would have been the first person to laugh at someone telling this story, but I know what I saw. I saw a family, a father, mother, and child, eating apples from my orchard. They weren't human, but they weren't animals either. They were something in between, something that shakes the foundations of how I understand the world. And sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm alone in the house, I swear I can hear that deep, resonant rumble echoing through the valley. It doesn't scare me anymore. It reminds me that there are still mysteries in this world, things we don't understand and maybe aren't meant to. All I know is that I'll keep growing my apples, and I've started leaving boxes of the best ones at the edge of the orchard. By morning, they're always empty. Story 9. I've never really told anyone the full story of what happened that day in '73. I mean, I've mentioned bits and pieces to family, but I've never laid it all out like this. Even now, almost 50 years later, I get this sick feeling in my stomach thinking about it. It was August of '73, hot and sticky like Pennsylvania gets in late summer. My little girl had just turned 3 that June, and she was at that age where she wanted to be everywhere at once, full of energy and curiosity. I was a single mum then, working 2 jobs, but always tried to make time for her. That particular Saturday morning, I had promised to visit St. James Cemetery to tend to my parents' graves. They had passed within 6 months of each other back in '71, and I tried to keep their plots neat. My daughter loved coming with me, not because she understood what a cemetery was, but because there was space to run around and lots of interesting stones to look at. It was about 9 in the morning when we arrived. The cemetery was pretty much empty, which wasn't unusual. St. James was one of those older cemeteries, tucked away off a side road, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. It wasn't fancy or anything, just peaceful. The morning was already warm, but there was a nice breeze moving through the trees. I parked the car near my parents' plots and got out the small gardening tools I'd brought. Just a trowel, some clippers, and a little brush to clean the headstones. My daughter immediately hopped out and started exploring, picking dandelions and examining interesting rocks. I kept her in my sight as I started working, occasionally calling out to make sure she didn't wander too far. "Stay where I can see you, honey," I'd call, and she'd wave at me with her chubby little hand before continuing her adventures. The cemetery had this particular smell that day, freshly cut grass mixed with the earthy scent of soil and the sweetness of the wildflowers that grew along the edges. I remember this so clearly because the smell changed so suddenly when everything happened. I'd been working for about 45 minutes, pulling weeds and trimming around my dad's headstone, when I felt something change. It's hard to explain, but the air seemed to shift. The birds, which had been chattering in the trees, suddenly went quiet. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a hawk had flown overhead or something, but then I noticed the silence was complete. No insects buzzing, no leaves rustling, nothing. I looked up to check on my daughter and saw her standing absolutely still about 30 feet away, facing the tree line. She had dropped her little collection of flowers and was just staring. I followed her gaze toward the edge of the woods. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a man, maybe a groundskeeper or someone visiting graves on the far side of the cemetery. But as my eyes focused, I realized whatever it wasn't human, not completely, anyway. It was standing just at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadows, but clearly visible enough that I could make out its shape. It was tall, much taller than me, and I'm 5'7", maybe 7 feet, possibly more, and it was covered in dark, matted hair or fur from its head all the way down. The hair was a deep brown, almost black in the shadows. It was standing on 2 legs, completely upright like a person. That's what struck me most, how human its posture was, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung too low, almost to its knees, and its shoulders were massive, much broader than any man I'd ever seen. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could tell it had eyes that were fixed directly on us, not just in our general direction, but specifically watching us, watching my daughter. The most terrifying part was that my little girl had started walking toward it. Slow, small steps, but definitely moving in its direction. There was no fear in her posture. It was almost like she was in some kind of trance. I called her name, trying to keep my voice calm at first. "Honey, come back to Mommy now." She didn't respond, didn't turn, just kept walking toward the creature. That's when real panic set in. I dropped everything and ran toward her, calling her name louder now, not caring if I sounded hysterical. As I moved, the creature shifted its weight, taking a step forward out of the tree line and into the cemetery grounds proper. In the clearer light, I could see more of it. Its face was dark, partially covered by the same coarse hair that covered its body, but with a pronounced brow and what looked like a flatter nose than a human would have. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They were dark, but had this intelligence in them that made my blood run cold. Not animal eyes, something else. I reached my daughter and grabbed her, probably harder than I should have, but I was terrified. She seemed confused, like she was waking up from a dream, and started to protest as I lifted her into my arms. She was pointing at the creature, saying something I couldn't understand through her sudden tears. The thing was now fully out of the woods, standing maybe 50 yards away from us. It wasn't charging or running, just watching with an eerie stillness. A smell hit me then, like wet dog mixed with something musky and wild. The air felt heavy with it. I turned and ran toward our car, clutching my daughter so tight she started squirming. I didn't look back until I reached the car, fumbling with the keys while trying to hold on to her. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the creature had moved closer, not rushing, but covering ground with long, deliberate strides. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys. I remember the sound they made hitting the gravel, this tiny metallic noise that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I crouched down, still holding my daughter with one arm, and snatched them up. I got the door open and practically threw my daughter into the car, not even bothering with her car seat. I slammed her door shut and ran around to the driver's side, the whole time feeling exposed, like at any moment that thing would be right behind me. As I got in and jammed the key into the ignition, I looked up one more time. The creature had stopped about 30 yards from our car. It was just standing there, watching us with what I can only describe as curiosity. Not aggression, not hunger, just interest. Somehow that was worse than if it had been charging at us. The engine started with a roar that made me jump, and I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel as I backed up and then sped down the cemetery road. In the rear-view mirror, I could see it still standing there, watching until we rounded a bend and it disappeared from view. My daughter was crying in the passenger seat, more from my reaction than from fear, I think. She kept asking why we had to leave, saying she wanted to talk to the big man. Those words sent ice through my veins. I drove straight home without stopping, constantly checking the mirrors as if that thing might somehow be following our car. By the time we got home, my daughter had calmed down and seemed to have already forgotten what happened. She wanted lunch and to play with her toys like it was any normal day. I was a wreck. I locked all the doors and windows, pulled all the curtains shut and kept checking outside every few minutes. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that it was just a man in dark clothes and my mind had played tricks on me. But I knew what I saw. That night, after I put my daughter to bed, I heard something moving around outside the house. Heavy footsteps circling, pausing occasionally. I sat in the dark living room, clutching a kitchen knife, too terrified to look out the windows, but too afraid not to listen. The footsteps eventually faded away just before dawn. 2 days later, Mrs. Connor from down the road called. She'd been letting her dog out around dusk when she saw what she described as a hairy man standing at the edge of her property watching her house. She'd called the police, but by the time they arrived, whatever it was had gone. Then the Petersons, who lived between my house and Mrs. Connor's, reported their garbage cans had been knocked over and emptied, but not by raccoons or bears. The cans had been carefully opened, not torn apart, and specific items had been removed. Over the next week, 5 different neighbors within a mile radius of my house reported seeing something similar, all describing a large, hair-covered bipedal creature that watched houses from a distance but never approached when people were visible. Always at dusk or dawn, always alone, always watching. My house was about 5 miles from St. James Cemetery. I became convinced that whatever I'd seen there had followed us home. The thought that it had tracked us over that distance, that it knew where we lived, kept me awake for nights on end. I never saw it directly again, but for weeks afterward, I'd find strange things around our property, branches arranged in unnatural patterns, rocks stacked in small piles, once even a dead rabbit placed carefully on our back step, not torn apart, just placed there. What haunts me most is how my daughter had responded to it. The way she walked toward it without fear, like she was being called. When I asked her about the big man in the cemetery, she would just smile and say he was nice and wanted to show her something. I never let her play outside alone after that, not ever. The sightings around the neighborhood stopped after about 2 weeks. Life slowly returned to normal, or something like it. I convinced myself it was over, whatever it was. But to this day, I still check the locks twice before bed. I still scan the tree line when I'm outside, and sometimes, on quiet nights when the world goes suddenly still, I get the overwhelming sense that something is watching, patient, intelligent, waiting. And I wonder if it's still out there, remembering us just as clearly as I remember it. Story 10. I've been sitting on this experience for years now, going back and forth about whether I should share it. I guess I'm finally ready. This happened on October 22nd, 2018, and it completely changed me. I've only told my husband and my sister about it until now, I live about 15 minutes from Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio. It's beautiful there. I used to go 3 or 4 times a week with my golden retriever, Max. We had this one trail we always did, this 3-mile loop that was just perfect. Not too challenging, but long enough to feel like we'd gotten some exercise. I knew every bend, every landmark on that trail. Or at least, I thought I did. That Monday was a normal fall day, cool but not cold, maybe in the low 60s. I remember I wore my blue fleece and some hiking pants. Max was extra excited that morning, practically pulling me to the car. Looking back, I wonder if he somehow sensed something was different. We got to the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of cars, which wasn't unusual for a weekday. Max and I set off, and everything felt completely normal for the first mile and a half. The trail was covered in fall leaves, that familiar crunch under my boots. I remember noticing some particularly pretty red maple leaves and thinking I should take a photo on the way back. Then everything changed. It happened so suddenly I almost can't explain it. One minute the woods were filled with normal sounds, birds, the rustling of leaves, distant cars on the nearby road. The next minute, absolute silence. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you sometimes get in nature. This was different, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I actually stopped walking, trying to figure out what felt wrong. That's when I noticed Max. He never acts up on our walks. He's the sweetest, most gentle dog you could imagine, but suddenly he was standing rigid, his hackles completely raised, staring into the trees to our right. He started this low growl. I'd never heard from him before. It didn't even sound like him. "Max, what's wrong?" I whispered. My voice sounded way too loud in that silence. He just kept growling, and I felt this cold sensation travel up my spine. My body knew something was wrong before my brain could catch up. I followed Max's gaze, and that's when I saw it. At first I couldn't process what I was looking at. My mind tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear, a person in a coat? But as it stepped forward from between 2 large oak trees, there was no mistaking what I was seeing. It was massive, easily over 8 feet tall. Its entire body was covered in dark, almost black hair that hung in patches of different lengths. The shoulders were impossibly wide, like twice as broad as any human I've ever seen. The proportions were just wrong. Its arms hung lower than a person's would, with huge hands that looked capable of snapping branches without effort. But it was the face that made me stop breathing. It had this conical-shaped head with a heavy brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. The face wasn't quite human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen either. Those eyes, they were dark and set deep, but they were looking right at me with clear intelligence. That's what terrifies me the most to this day, the awareness in those eyes. It stepped directly onto the trail about 30 feet ahead of us, blocking our path forward. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd turned to concrete. Max went from growling to full-on barking, lunging against his leash. I was clutching that leash so tightly my knuckles were white, but part of me was worried he'd break free and run toward the thing. The creature, the Bigfoot, looked down at Max, and I swear it was annoyed. Then it made this sound that I still hear in my nightmares sometimes. It wasn't a roar exactly, more like a deep rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the air around us. It was so loud and so low that I felt it in my chest. Max immediately stopped barking. He let out this pitiful yelp and backed up against my legs, trembling. This dog, who'd fearlessly chased off a coyote from our yard once, was absolutely terrified. We stood there staring at each other. 5 seconds, 20 seconds, I don't know. Time stopped making sense. I couldn't even think clearly enough to decide whether to run or back away slowly or what. My brain just kept repeating, "This isn't real, this isn't real." But every other part of me knew it absolutely was. What happened next is something I keep turning over in my mind. The creature suddenly stepped toward a huge tree trunk beside the trail, an old oak that would have taken 2 people to wrap their arms around. Without breaking eye contact with me, it raised one of those massive arms and slapped the tree with an open palm. The sound was like a gunshot. Bark actually flew off the tree. It was a display of strength, and I understood the message clearly. This is what I could do to you. I couldn't help it. I let out this choked sob. I think that's what snapped me out of my frozen state. I was suddenly aware that I was alone in the woods with this thing, and no one knew where I was. The Bigfoot tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious about my reaction. Then, without any warning, it simply turned and stepped off the trail, disappearing into the thick trees with shocking speed and silence for something so large. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I yanked on Max's leash, turned around and ran. I didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. Max was right there with me, not pulling ahead like he usually would when we ran together. He stayed pressed against my side the whole way, constantly looking back over his shoulder. When we finally reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before I could unlock the door. I remember sitting in the driver's seat for several minutes, gasping for breath, unable to even turn the key in the ignition. Max was in the passenger seat, still trembling, making these little whimpering noises I'd never heard before. The drive home is a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following us somehow. When I got home, I locked all the doors and closed all the blinds. My husband wasn't due home from work for hours, and I couldn't decide if I should call him or not. What would I even say? I took a shower, trying to calm down, but I kept replaying the encounter in my head, the silence of the forest. Those intelligent eyes, the way it slapped that tree like it was nothing. When my husband got home, he could tell something was wrong immediately. I broke down crying as soon as he walked in. I told him everything, fully expecting him to think I was crazy or had somehow misinterpreted what I'd seen. But he just listened, holding me while I shook and sobbed through the story. "I believe you," he said when I finished. That meant everything to me. The next few weeks were hard. I had trouble sleeping, and when I did, I had nightmares about being chased through endless woods. I jumped at every sound outside our house. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the park, not the next day, not the next week, not for almost 3 years afterward. Max was even more affected. He went from being this confident, adventurous dog to being nervous and jumpy. He'd bark at shadows in our yard. He refused to go on walks if they led toward any densely wooded areas. For months after the encounter, he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night growling at nothing, his eyes fixed on our bedroom window. I told my sister about the encounter a few weeks after it happened. She didn't laugh or dismiss it, but she did gently suggest that maybe stress or anxiety had caused me to misinterpret something ordinary. I stopped talking about it after that. I've spent countless hours researching Bigfoot sightings since then. There have been other reports from Cuyahoga Valley over the years. Nothing exactly like mine, but similar enough that I know I'm not alone. I've read scientific arguments that such creatures can't possibly exist, and I've read compelling eyewitness accounts from people who sound completely rational. Before my experience, I probably would have sided with the scientists. Now, I don't have that luxury. It's been almost 5 years, and I've only been back to Cuyahoga Valley a handful of times, always with my husband, always on busy, popular trails. I've never returned to that specific loop. Max still refuses to go far into any forest. He's older now, but that wariness has never left him. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd reacted differently. If I'd tried to communicate somehow, if I'd had a camera ready, would it have attacked me? Was it just trying to warn me away from its territory? I'll never know. What I do know is that something impossible stood in front of me that day. Something that shouldn't exist according to everything I was taught about the natural world. But it was there, as real as the tree it struck, as real as my dog's fear, as real as the nightmares I still sometimes have. I don't expect everyone to believe me, Sometimes I wish I could convince myself it wasn't real. But then I look at Max, see how he still stares into the trees at the edge of our yard with that same intensity, and I know what we experienced was real. The silence of those woods that day, that unnatural, complete absence of sound, that's what I remember most clearly. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my backyard at dusk and the birds suddenly stop singing, I find myself holding my breath, listening, waiting. Story 11. I grew up on the east side of Weatherford, pretty much a stone's throw from Town Creek. When you're 12 years old in a small town, you make your own fun. For me and my buddy, that meant walking the creek, looking for raccoons to hunt on weekend nights. We weren't really the destructive types, just normal kids exploring the outdoors, feeling like we were on some kind of adventure. This particular night started like any other. It was early fall, cool but not cold, and we had our flashlights and BB guns. We'd done this a dozen times before. Follow the creek, shine lights into trees, looking for the reflective eyes of raccoons. Sometimes we'd catch sight of one and take a shot, but honestly, we rarely hit anything. It was more about being out there, feeling like little explorers in our own backyard wilderness. We were heading toward this swimming hole that all the local kids used in summer. It was maybe half a mile from my house, tucked away where the creek widened a bit. As we got closer, this smell hit us, and I mean hit us. It wasn't just bad. It was wrong, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. I remember gagging instantly, and my friend covered his mouth and nose with his shirt. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice muffled through his t-shirt. I didn't answer because I was trying not to throw up. The smell seemed to get thicker as we moved forward, like walking through invisible syrup. My eyes were watering, and my nose burned like someone had shoved ammonia up it. We were both stubborn kids though, so instead of turning back like we should have, we kept going. I was shining my flashlight up into the trees, partly looking for raccoons, but mostly trying to distract myself from the smell. The beam caught on something in the branches about 30 feet up, and for just a second, I swear I saw two eyes reflect back. Not small like a raccoon's, but big and set apart. Before I could get a better look, they were gone. That's when we heard the splash. It wasn't like when you throw a rock in water or when a fish jumps. This was heavy, like when a full-grown person cannonballs into a pool, but somehow even bigger. The sound echoed off the trees, and the water must have sprayed at least 6 feet up because we could hear it raining back down. My friend grabbed my arm so tight it left bruises I found the next day. "What was that?" he whispered again, but his voice had changed. There was real fear there. We froze for maybe 5 seconds before curiosity got the better of us. We crept forward, still clutching our BB guns, like they would do anything against whatever had made that noise. When we reached the edge of the swimming hole, our flashlights showed nothing but disturbed water. It was cloudy with stirred-up mud, still sloshing against the banks from whatever had fallen in, or jumped in, or climbed out. We stood there for what felt like forever, scanning the water and both banks with our lights. Nothing moved except the gradually settling water. The smell was still there, but it seemed to be fading a little. Or maybe my nose had just gotten used to it. "I think we should go," I said, my voice sounding weird and tight even to me. My friend just nodded, and we backed away slowly before turning and walking faster than we wanted to admit back toward home. Here's where it gets stranger. 3 days later, the man who owned the property near the swimming hole, Mr. Johnson, an old guy who mostly left us kids alone as long as we weren't causing trouble, came to talk to my parents. I was in the kitchen when he arrived, and I heard him ask my dad if he could speak to me. My dad called me over, and Mr. Johnson looked at me real serious-like and asked, "Did you boys tear down my flood fence the other night?" For those who don't know, a flood fence is basically just a wire and post fence that crosses a creek. It keeps livestock from wandering down the creek bed, but lets water flow through. Pretty simple structure. "No, sir," I said, completely honest. "We hadn't touched any fence." He stared at me hard, like he was trying to see if I was lying. Someone or something did. It's completely mangled, posts pulled right out of the ground. My dad asked if maybe the recent rains had washed it out, but Mr. Johnson shook his head. This wasn't water damage. The wire's been pulled apart, twisted, posts snapped, not washed away. Would have taken a lot of strength to do what was done to it. I felt cold all over. The fence he was talking about was just downstream from where we'd heard that splash. I swear we didn't do it, I said again. We were out there, but we didn't touch your fence. Mr. Johnson eventually left, seemingly satisfied that a couple of 12-year-old boys couldn't have done the kind of damage he was describing. My dad gave me a look afterward that said he believed me, but he was puzzled too. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the splash, the eyes in the trees, and now this destroyed fence. It made me remember something I'd tried to forget for years. When I was 7, 5 years before this incident, me, my brother, and the neighbor boy had been playing near that same stretch of creek. It was still daylight then, late afternoon in summer. We were just messing around, having stick fights and pretending to be explorers when my brother suddenly went quiet and pointed across the field. There, maybe 200 yards away, was a large, dark figure moving across the open land. At first I thought it might be a person, but as I watched it, I realized it was too big, too wide. It moved with this smooth, purposeful stride that didn't look quite right. The neighbor kid whispered, "What is that?" We all stood frozen, watching as this thing approached a 5-strand barbed wire fence. Without slowing down, it just stepped over it. Not climbed, not crawled through. Stepped over a fence that had to be at least 4 feet high. Its stride barely changed. It crossed the old railroad tracks next, then disappeared into the heavy brush beyond. My brother, always the bravest, or stupidest of us, raised his BB gun and fired a couple of shots in that direction. The figure never reacted, never looked our way, just kept that same steady pace until it was gone from sight. When we told our parents, they dismissed it as imagination, or said maybe it was just a hobo walking through. But I knew better. No human I'd ever seen could step over a fence like that without breaking stride. No human was that size, broad and tall and just wrong-looking. For years, I convinced myself it had been a bear, though I'd never heard of bears in our area, or maybe a really big deer seen from a weird angle. Kids' imaginations can run wild, right? But after what happened at the creek when I was 12, those old doubts came flooding back. The next day after Mr. Johnson's visit, I made an excuse to go back to the creek alone. I don't know what I was thinking. That I'd find evidence. That I'd solve some mystery. I just knew I had to go look. When I reached the swimming hole, everything seemed normal. The water was clear again. The smell completely gone. I followed the creek downstream to where Mr. Johnson's fence crossed it. What I saw made my stomach drop. The fence was destroyed, just like he'd said. The wire had been pulled and twisted like someone had grabbed it and yanked with incredible force. One of the wooden posts was snapped clean in half. Another had been pulled completely out of the ground, concrete base and all. This wasn't vandalism by teenagers. This wasn't flood damage. Whatever had done this had to be incredibly strong. I scanned the muddy banks, looking for footprints, but the ground was a mess of overlapping tracks, probably from Mr. Johnson and whoever had helped him discover the damage. If there had been anything unusual, it was long trampled over. I did find one thing, though, caught on what remained of the fence, a clump of dark, coarse hair. Nothing like the hair of the cattle that sometimes grazed nearby. I reached out to touch it, but a sudden wave of fear stopped me. I backed away and headed home, walking faster and faster until I was practically running. I never told anyone about finding the hair. I never went back to that swimming hole again, at least not alone. My friend and I stopped our raccoon hunting trips altogether. We never really discussed why. It was like an unspoken agreement that some things were better left alone. Over the years, I've heard stories from others in the area, strange sounds at night, livestock acting nervous for no reason, occasional reports of something large moving through the woods. Most people chalk it up to wild hogs or the occasional mountain lion passing through, but I know what I saw when I was 7, and I know what I heard that night when I was 12. Something big enough to make that splash, something strong enough to destroy that fence, something that left behind hair unlike any animal I was familiar with. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or some other cryptid. I honestly don't know what it was. But whatever crossed that field and stepped over that fence without breaking stride wasn't human. And I'm pretty sure it's the same thing that dove into that swimming hole and tore apart Mr. Johnson's flood fence. I still live in the same county, though not in my childhood home. Sometimes when I drive past that area, I slow down and look toward the creek. I never see anything unusual now, but I never stop the car either. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some corners of the world are better left unexplored. And some creatures, whatever they might be, are better left undisturbed in the shadows along creek beds and in the dense brush beyond old railroad tracks. I don't have proof. I don't have answers. All I have is the memory of a smell that burned my nose, the sound of a splash too heavy for any normal animal, and the image of something impossibly large crossing a field and stepping over a barbed wire fence, like it was nothing more than a small step. And sometimes that's more than enough to keep me awake at night. 20 years later. Story 12. I still get nightmares about it. May 16th, 2009. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. It's been years, but my hands still shake when I think about it. I've only told a few close friends about what happened, and most of them gave me that look. You know the one. The "this person has lost their mind" look. But I know what I saw. I know what attacked me. That Saturday morning started like any other weekend ride. I'd been mountain biking through Allegheny National Forest for years. Northern Pennsylvania has some of the best trails on the East Coast. I had packed light, just water, some energy bars, basic tools for the bike, and my phone. The weather was perfect, around 65 degrees, partly cloudy, with a slight breeze rustling through the trees. I remember feeling particularly good that morning. I'd just upgraded my bike with a new suspension system and was eager to test it out on some of the rougher trails deeper in the forest. I parked at an isolated trailhead about 15 miles from Kane, Pennsylvania. There were no other vehicles in the small gravel lot, which wasn't unusual for this remote area. The first hour was amazing. The trail had enough technical challenges to keep it interesting, but nothing too brutal. The forest was vibrant and alive, birds calling, squirrels darting across the path, the occasional deer watching from a distance. I felt that familiar rush that comes from being alone in nature, just me and my bike navigating the wilderness. Around 11 in the morning, I decided to try a trail branch I'd never taken before. It wasn't on any of the official maps, but I could see it was well worn enough to follow. This is where things started getting different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on what changed. The trail narrowed and began to wind between tighter groupings of old-growth trees. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy overhead, but it was something else that made the hair on my neck stand up. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects buzzing, nothing. In all my years of riding these woods, I'd never experienced anything like it. It was as if someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. Even the sound of the wind in the trees seemed to vanish. All I could hear was my own breathing, the crunch of my tires on the trail, and my heart beginning to pound in my chest. I slowed down a bit, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. You know that feeling, right? When your primitive brain is screaming that something's not right. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake it. That's when I first heard it. Heavy footsteps somewhere behind me, matching my pace. At first, I thought it might be another biker, but the rhythm was all wrong. These were heavy, deliberate steps. Thud, thud, thud. Too slow for a person running, too fast and too heavy for a deer. I sped up. The footsteps behind me sped up too. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked a little. I started pedaling harder, pushing my bike faster than was probably safe on the unfamiliar trail. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I navigated around tight corners and over exposed roots. The footsteps kept pace, getting closer. Then I heard something that sends chills through me even now when I think about it. A deep, guttural breath. Not an animal panting, not a person gasping for air. This was something else entirely. Deep, controlled, and purposeful. I made the mistake of looking back over my shoulder. That split-second glance almost caused me to crash into a tree. I caught just a glimpse of movement, something massive and dark, moving through the trees parallel to the trail. I couldn't make out details, just the impression of something huge keeping pace with me about 30 yards back. I've never pedaled so hard in my life. My lungs were burning, legs pumping furiously. I remember thinking if I could just make it back to the main trail, back to where other hikers or bikers might be. Then it happened. The deep breath behind me transformed into a roar that seemed to shake the entire forest. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. It was primal and terrifying, like something from another time. Before I could process what I was hearing, something slammed into the back of my bike with tremendous force. I remember the sickening feeling of becoming airborne, then the impact as I hit the ground hard about 10 feet off the trail. My helmet cracked against a rock and pain exploded through my left shoulder. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I lay there in the dirt and fallen leaves, stunned and disoriented. That's when the smell hit me, an overwhelming stench of rotting meat, damp earth, and a musky sweat that made my eyes water. It was so thick I could taste it. I rolled onto my back, and that's when I saw it. Standing over me was something that shouldn't exist, something that my brain kept trying to categorize but couldn't. A creature, massive and imposing, breathing heavily as it stared down at me. It was covered in thick, dark hair. Not fur, but hair, matted in some places with what looked like mud, twigs, and forest debris. The hair wasn't uniform in length. It was longer around the shoulders and shorter on the massive arms. The coloration wasn't a single shade either, predominantly dark brown, but with patches that were almost black in places, especially around the chest and shoulders. Its body was enormous, broad-shouldered, with a barrel chest that tapered to a narrower waist. The proportions were all wrong for a human, but not quite like any animal I'd ever seen either. Its arms hung longer than a person's would, with huge hands ending in thick, dirty fingernails that looked like they could tear through bark. But it was the face that paralyzed me with fear. Under a heavy, protruding brow ridge were eyes that will haunt me forever, deep-set and intelligent, watching me with what I can only describe as a calculated intensity. They weren't the eyes of an animal looking at prey. There was something else there, something I recognized as consciousness, as intention. Its nose was broad and flat, and below it a mouth hung slightly open, revealing thick, square teeth that weren't exactly like human teeth, but weren't like a predator's fangs either. Strings of saliva dripped from its mouth onto the dirt just inches from my face. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was certain I was about to die. Then it leaned down closer to my face, so close I could feel its hot breath on my skin, and roared, not the kind of roar you hear in movies. This was something that vibrated through my entire body, something I felt in my bones. The ground beneath me seemed to shake with the force of it. When it finished, it raised one massive arm and slammed its fist into the ground beside my head with such force that I felt the earth compress beneath me. Dirt and debris sprayed across my face. The message was clear. It could have crushed my skull just as easily. I remember thinking in a strange moment of clarity, this is how I die. I closed my eyes, waiting for the killing blow, but it never came. Instead, The creature suddenly jerked its head to the side, as if hearing something I couldn't. Its entire posture changed in an instant, from dominating to alert, almost wary. It straightened up to its full height, which had to be well over 7 feet, maybe closer to 8. Standing at its full height, silhouetted against the filtered forest light, it was even more imposing. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its head seemingly attached directly to those shoulders with little visible neck. The sheer mass of muscle under that hair-covered skin was evident in every movement. It looked down at me once more, let out another roar, shorter this time, but no less terrifying. And then it was gone, crashing through the underbrush with surprising speed for something so large. I lay there for several minutes, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. My whole body was shaking uncontrollably. Eventually, basic survival instinct kicked in. I had to get out of there. My bike was about 15 feet away. The back wheel bent badly out of shape, the frame dented. My shoulder throbbed with pain when I tried to move it. Probably separated, I later learned. My helmet had a crack running along the side where I'd hit the rock. I managed to get to my feet and retrieve my bike, but it was unrideable. I had no choice but to walk it back along the trail, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. What should have been a 20-minute ride became a terrifying 1-hour trek back to my car. The whole time, I kept replaying what had happened in my head, what I had seen, what had attacked me. I knew what it was, but my mind kept trying to find alternative explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs. No, the proportions were all wrong, and the face, that face wasn't anything like a bear's, a person in some kind of costume. The movements were too fluid, the strength too real, the roar too powerful. No, I knew what I had encountered, even if I didn't want to admit it to myself. When I finally made it back to my car, I threw my damaged bike in the trunk and drove straight to the nearest urgent care center, telling them I'd crashed my bike. The doctor who examined me didn't question my story. Mountain biking accidents are common enough. I had a separated shoulder, multiple bruises, and a mild concussion. Physically, I healed within a few weeks. Mentally, I'm still not sure I've fully processed what happened that day. I've only gone back to Allegheny National Forest once since then, and I stayed on the main trails with a group. I still mountain bike, but never alone and never in remote areas. I know what I saw. I know what attacked me, a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. It was real, it was intelligent, and it could have killed me if it wanted to. Why it didn't, I'll never know. Most people don't believe me when I tell them, so I've mostly stopped trying. But I know what happened. Every time I catch a certain scent, that mixture of decay and musk, I'm right back there on that forest floor, looking up into those eyes, feeling that hot breath on my face, waiting to die. Story 13. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that day up north of White Pass. This was about 3 years ago during elk season. I'm an experienced hunter, had been doing it since I was 16 with my dad, but nothing in 20 years of hunting prepared me for what I encountered. It was early November, perfect time for elk hunting with my muzzle loader. I'd been planning this solo trip for months, scouting locations on topo maps. There's this particular canyon area I'd never explored before, about 4 miles north of White Pass ski area. Really remote spot. Most hunters stick to the more accessible areas, but I figured the deeper wilderness might yield better results. I set out before dawn, drove to my starting point, and hiked in about 3 miles before first light. The morning was crisp but clear, typical fall weather in the Cascades. The forecast mentioned possible snow later, but nothing major. I had my day pack with essentials: water, jerky, extra ammunition, first aid kit, knife, fire starter, the usual. My Thompson Center muzzle loader was loaded and ready, and I felt confident about the day ahead. By mid-morning, I'd made it into this canyon I'd spotted on the maps. It was deeper and more secluded than I expected. Steep walls rising on both sides, thick with old-growth cedar and fir. The kind of pristine wilderness that makes you feel like you might be the first person to set foot there in years. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves and moss, which helped muffle my footsteps. Around 11, the weather started turning. Clouds rolled in quickly, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Soon, snowflakes were drifting down, just a few at first, then more steadily. I wasn't too concerned. I had proper gear and was dressed in layers. Plus, I'd checked my GPS and knew my position relative to my truck. I continued working my way deeper into the canyon, moving slowly and quietly, scanning for any sign of elk. The snow was actually a good thing for tracking. Fresh snow shows tracks clearly. By noon, it was coming down pretty heavily, but visibility was still decent, maybe 50 to 60 yards. That's when things got weird. I was moving along the north side of the canyon just below the ridge when I spotted movement in a thick stand of cedars about 40 yards ahead. I immediately froze and raised my scope to my eye. Through the falling snow, I could make out what I thought was the dark hindquarter of an elk moving through the trees. My heart started pounding like it always does when I spot game. I carefully stepped closer, trying to get a better angle. The wind was in my favor, blowing toward me, so I wasn't worried about my scent giving me away. When I was about 30 yards from the cedar thicket, something crashed through the undergrowth. Not one animal, but what sounded like multiple. I assumed it was a small herd of elk I'd startled. But what I heard next wasn't elk, it wasn't bear, it wasn't any wildlife I've ever encountered in the Pacific Northwest. There was this chattering, like a series of rapid huffs and guttural noises. The sound reminded me of videos I've seen of chimpanzees, but deeper, more resonant. It was coming from the direction where the animals had fled, maybe 60 yards away now. Then, and this is what made my skin crawl, another similar vocalization responded from farther up the canyon on my side. They were communicating, two separate individuals. I stood completely still, my finger instinctively moving to the trigger of my muzzle loader. The snow was falling heavier now, limiting visibility to maybe 30 yards. I strained to see through the trees and the white curtain of snowfall, but couldn't spot anything. Then a third vocalization came from across the canyon. This one was deeper, louder, almost like someone trying to imitate an ape, but with a human-like quality to it. The first two immediately went silent. I've been in the woods my entire life. I've heard elk bugle, bears growl, cougar scream, and all manner of forest creatures. This was completely different. These were coordinated communications between three separate beings. For several minutes, I just listened, barely breathing. The huffing and chattering continued sporadically. It was clear they were talking to each other, for lack of a better term. Sometimes the vocalizations were quiet, almost whispered. Other times they'd suddenly get louder, more urgent. My mind was racing. Escaped zoo animals, some kind of elaborate prank. But I was miles from anywhere, in heavy snow, in terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. The rational explanations weren't adding up. I decided to try and get a look at whatever was making these sounds. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept toward where the closest vocalizations were coming from. The snow was about 2 inches deep now, which made silent movement difficult. I'd take a few careful steps, then pause to listen. The sounds continued, but they were moving too, staying just out of visual range. It seemed like they were paralleling me, maintaining distance. That's when I realized they knew exactly where I was. They were tracking me. A heavy feeling of dread settled in my stomach. The snowfall was getting worse, and I checked my watch to see it was already 2 in the afternoon. In November, darkness would come around 4:30. The temperature was dropping fast, and the storm was intensifying beyond what was forecast. I made the decision to turn back. Something wasn't right, and with the weather deteriorating, I didn't want to risk being stranded after dark. I started retracing my steps, moving more quickly now, no longer concerned about being quiet. As I retreated, the vocalizations followed me. They kept their distance, but they were definitely shadowing my movement. Sometimes from behind me, sometimes paralleling me through the trees. I never caught more than fleeting glimpses of dark shapes moving through the forest. Once, I thought I saw something large moving upright between two trees about 50 yards away, but the snow made it impossible to be sure. What disturbed me most was how these things moved through the terrain. The canyon was steep and rugged, with dense undergrowth and downed trees everywhere. Yet whatever was following me navigated it effortlessly, much faster and quieter than I could, despite their apparent size. By the time I was about a mile from where I'd first heard the sounds, the vocalizations had stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, keeping my muzzle loader ready. The last hour of hiking back to my truck was the longest of my life. The snow was coming down in a near whiteout. Temperatures were dropping fast, and darkness was approaching. I've never felt such relief as when I finally spotted my vehicle. I threw my gear in the truck, cranked the heater, and sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had happened. Had I imagined it? Was it just strange echoes in the canyon, distorted by the snow and trees? But I knew what I'd heard. 3 distinct entities communicating with each other, tracking me through the forest. I told myself I'd never go back to that canyon. But curiosity is a powerful thing. The following year, during the same hunting season, I returned, not all the way into the canyon, but to the same general area. I wanted to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation for what I'd experienced. It was a clear day, no snow in the forecast. I hiked in about 2 miles, approaching the edge of the canyon where I'd had my experience the previous year. I was being extra cautious, moving slowly, stopping frequently to listen and observe. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes, standing in a small clearing at the canyon's edge when it happened. There was a loud crack from the canopy above, and something came crashing through the branches. A rock, about the size of a grapefruit, hit the ground with a heavy thud just 8 feet from where I was standing. This wasn't a natural occurrence. The rock hadn't fallen from the canyon wall. It had come from above the tree canopy on level ground and smashed through the branches with significant force. It had been thrown. I didn't wait around to see what threw it. I turned and hiked out of there faster than I've ever moved through the woods. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I kept looking back, half expecting to see something pursuing me, but the forest remained still. I've never returned to that canyon since, and I never will. I've researched local wildlife extensively, trying to find any explanation for what I experienced. There isn't one, at least not one that fits into our conventional understanding of North American wildlife. I don't know what lives in that remote canyon north of White Pass. I don't know if there's some undocumented primate species or something else entirely. But I know they're intelligent enough to communicate, coordinated enough to track a human through difficult terrain, and aware enough to try to scare me away when I returned. Sometimes at night, I still hear those huffing, chattering vocalizations in my dreams, and I wake up certain of one thing. Whatever was in that canyon wasn't elk or bear. It was something that doesn't want to be found. Something that protects its territory, something that watches and waits in the deep woods where people rarely go, and it knows we're out there. Story 14. I've never told this story online before, but it's been eating at me for years. I need to get it out there, even if some people think I'm making it up. I'm not. What happened to us that day in the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. It was October 14th, 2001. A crisp fall day, perfect for hunting. 4 of us had planned this trip for weeks, all experienced hunters who'd spent our lives in the outdoors. We knew the area west of Manistee pretty well, particularly that section near the Indian River Basin in Schoolcraft County. It's beautiful country, thick pine forests, hardwoods with their leaves turning, and sections of swampy ground that feed into the river flats. We drove 2 pickup trucks along this old service road that cuts through the forest, parked at our usual spot, and hiked in just after sunrise. Each of us carried our rifles and light packs with some water jerky and basic supplies. Nothing fancy. We weren't planning on staying overnight. Just a standard hunting day trip we'd done dozens of times before. The morning was uneventful. We saw some deer signs, but nothing worth taking a shot at. Around noon, we stopped to eat some sandwiches we'd packed, sitting on fallen logs and talking quietly about where to focus for the afternoon. The weather was holding good. About 50 degrees, slight breeze, partly cloudy, perfect hunting weather. By mid-afternoon, we'd spread out to cover more ground, keeping within earshot of each other. I'd found a good spot near a small clearing where deer often crossed. The forest was doing that thing it does in the afternoon, getting quieter as the day creatures settle and before the night animals wake up. That in-between time that's always felt a little strange to me. I remember checking my watch. It was about 3:45 when I heard it, a sharp, clear whistle from somewhere to my left. My first thought was that it was Mike signaling me. We sometimes used whistles to communicate without making too much noise, especially if someone spotted something good. I was about to whistle back when a second whistle came from the opposite direction, where Tom and Dave had gone. That's when the first chill went up my spine. It wasn't like any whistle I'd heard from my buddies before. It was wrong. Extremely loud and piercing, almost shrill, but carrying through the trees much further than a human whistle should. There was this hollow, echoing quality to it that made my skin crawl. I tried whistling back, just a short one to signal my position. The forest went completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Then another whistle came, closer this time, and it felt directed, like whatever made it knew exactly where I was standing. By 4:15, we'd all managed to regroup. Turns out, all 4 of us had heard the whistles, and they'd seemed to come from different sides of our position. None of us had moved from our spots when the whistles started, so we knew it wasn't any of us making them. Mike suggested it might be other hunters, but deep down, I don't think any of us believed that. We were discussing whether to head back to the trucks when we started hearing it, heavy footsteps moving in the brush around us, not like a deer or even a bear. Each impact made a thud you could feel through the ground. Leaves shook, and branches snapped under whatever weight was moving out there. "What the hell is that?" Dave whispered. None of us had an answer. The footsteps circled around, never in one place for long. I could hear deep breathing, almost like panting, coming from the darkness between the trees. Then the smell hit us, this incredibly strong, musky odor that made us gag. It was like wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I can't even describe. Not like any animal I've ever encountered in all my years in the woods. Around 4:30, Tom grabbed my arm and pointed. Between 2 birch trees about 40 yards away, something moved, something big. It stepped partially into view, staying low and hunched, then retreated back into the shadows. I only caught a glimpse, but what I saw didn't make sense. It was too big, too wrong. "Did you guys see that?" Tom's voice was shaking. Before anyone could answer, Mike pointed in the opposite direction. "There's another one." I turned and felt my blood run cold. Between the pines on the other side of the small clearing where we stood, a second figure appeared. Both were standing upright on 2 legs, but they were enormous, easily over 8 feet tall, with incredibly wide shoulders and long arms that hung down past their knees. I've been a hunter all my life. I know what bears look like, even when they stand on their hind legs. These weren't bears. They were covered in dark brown to black hair, longer in some places, shorter around what I could only describe as their chests. Both looked like mature males. I could see their parts and the heavy muscle definition under the hair. Their faces were pushed in, almost like a gorilla, but different, more human-like in some horrible way. We stood frozen, 4 grown men with rifles, terrified to move. The 2 creatures began circling our position, keeping just inside the tree line, communicating with those whistles we'd been hearing. Occasionally, one would reach out and slap a tree trunk with an open hand, making a cracking sound that echoed through the forest. Every time we tried to move in one direction, one of them would shift position to block our path. They were herding us, containing us in that small clearing. Mike raised his rifle at one point, and the nearest creature let out a low growl that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. Mike slowly lowered his gun. "They're too smart," Dave whispered. "They know what the guns are." By 5 o'clock, the sun was getting lower, filtering through the trees at an angle that cast long shadows across the ground. We knew we had to get out before dark. No way in hell I wanted to be in those woods after sunset with those things surrounding us. "We need to back toward the service road," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Slow, all together, don't run." We began our retreat, moving backward while facing the creatures, our rifles ready, but not raised. With each step we took, they would advance slightly, keeping the same distance between us. It was the most terrifying game of cat and mouse I've ever experienced. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears. The whole time, I kept thinking about stories I'd dismissed as bullshit my whole life. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I'd always laughed at those stories. I wasn't laughing now. We'd backed up maybe 100 yards when the nearest creature suddenly stopped and tilted its head, as if listening. From deeper in the woods, we heard a final whistle, different from the others, lower pitched and longer. Both creatures went completely still for several seconds. They just stood there, watching us with eyes I couldn't quite see, but could feel boring into me. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they turned and walked away with long, fluid strides into the forest. Not running, not afraid, just leaving, like they'd been called back by something. We didn't stick around to see if they'd changed their minds. We made it back to the trucks in record time, fumbling with the keys, our hands shaking so bad we could barely get the doors unlocked. No one spoke during the drive back to town. What was there to say? It's been over 20 years since that day in the woods near Manistique. The 4 of us have talked about it a few times over the years, but we've never told anyone else. Who would believe us? Hell, sometimes I don't even believe it myself until I wake up from those nightmares, smelling that musky odor that seems to have permanently lodged itself in my memory. I still hunt, but never in that area again, and never alone. Some people go their whole lives in the outdoors without seeing anything strange. We weren't that lucky. Whatever those creatures were, they were intelligent. They worked together. They communicated. They herded us like we were prey. And the worst part, I'm convinced they could have taken us at any time. They were just curious, or maybe testing us, I don't know. But I do know they're out there in those Michigan forests. And sometimes, when I'm in the woods anywhere, and the birds suddenly go quiet, I find myself listening for whistles and looking over my shoulder for something tall moving between the trees. Story 15. I've never really talked about this before, not in detail anyway. For the longest time I thought nobody would believe me, or worse, they'd laugh. My parents sure didn't take me seriously when it happened. But after all these years, I still can't explain what I saw that day in Colorado, and I need to get this off my chest. It was the summer of 1985. I was 12 years old, and we were on our annual family vacation. Dad had always wanted to explore Colorado's mountains, so we drove out from Nebraska in our old Chevy station wagon. The whole trip was supposed to be about hiking and fishing, typical outdoorsy stuff that my dad loved and my mom tolerated. We were driving through this canyon. I don't remember the exact name now, but it was maybe an hour west of Denver. The road wound through these massive rock walls that seemed to touch the sky. It was around mid-afternoon, probably 3 or 4 o'clock. The weather was perfect. Sunny but cool enough that we had the windows down instead of using the AC. I was sitting in the back seat, bored out of my mind. My Walkman batteries had died earlier that morning, and I'd already read all the comics I'd brought along. So I was just staring out the window, watching the scenery go by and counting the minutes until we'd reach our next stop. We were about 5 miles into this canyon when I noticed some cattle grazing on the right side of the road. Nothing unusual there, just regular brown and black cows scattered across this gentler part of the slope. The mountainside wasn't as steep there, maybe 50 or 60 feet from the road, with grass patches, some trees, and these massive boulders scattered around. Further up, though, the mountainside got really steep with some scary drop-offs. That's when I saw it. Among the cows, there was this thing, this enormous black figure walking upright. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a rancher in a coat, but no rancher would be that big. This figure towered over the cows. I mean, those were full-grown cattle, and this thing was easily 7 to 9 feet tall next to them. The size comparison hit me immediately. It was covered in black fur, not like a bear's fur, which looks kind of fluffy. This was longer, shaggy, almost matted in places, and the way it moved. God, I still see that movement in my head sometimes. It wasn't running, but it was moving with purpose. Its arms swung in this exaggerated way that humans don't move, taking these long strides like it was in a hurry to get somewhere. The arms, that's another thing that stands out in my memory. They were way too long for a human. They hung down almost to its knees, swinging wildly with each step. I never saw its face, though. It kept its back to the road the whole time, moving away from us, heading toward a cluster of pine trees further up the slope. The weirdest part? I couldn't make a sound. I was literally frozen, my mouth open but nothing coming out. It was like my brain short-circuited. I just sat there, watching this massive figure stride between the cattle, getting closer and closer to the tree line. It took maybe 3 or 4 minutes before I could speak. By then, we'd driven another mile down the canyon. "Dad," I finally managed to say, my voice coming out all shaky. "Dad, I just saw something really weird back there." "What's that, kiddo?" He was only half listening, focused on the narrow road. There was something back there with those cows, something big, walking on 2 legs. My mom turned around from the front passenger seat. "What do you mean, honey?" I tried to explain what I'd seen, the size, the black fur, the weird way it walked. As I talked, I could see my parents exchanging those looks that parents give each other when they think their kid is making stuff up. "It was probably just a rancher checking on his cattle," my dad said. But I could tell he was curious because he slowed the car down. "No, Dad, it was huge, way bigger than any person, and it was covered in fur." That's when he surprised me by pulling over to the side of the road. "You really saw something, huh?" I nodded, feeling this weird mix of relief that he was taking me seriously and dread about going back there. "All right, let's check it out." He made a U-turn on the empty canyon road, and we headed back to where the cattle were grazing. The drive back felt like forever, even though it was probably just a few minutes. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me was hoping the thing would still be there so my parents would see it and know I wasn't making it up. Another part was terrified of seeing it again. When we reached the spot, my dad pulled over, and we all stared out at the hillside. The cows were still there, grazing peacefully, like nothing had happened, but the black figure was gone, completely vanished. "Where did you see it?" my dad asked, scanning the area. I pointed to the spot near the trees. It was walking that way, toward those pines. My dad got out of the car, and I reluctantly followed. The summer air suddenly felt chilly. We stood on the roadside, looking up at the slope. The cows barely acknowledged our presence, continuing to graze without concern. "You're sure you saw something?" Dad asked, squinting in the sunlight. "I'm positive," I insisted. "It was right there, walking between those cows." "It was huge, Dad." My mom stayed in the car, watching us with a worried expression. I think she was more concerned about me than about any mysterious creature. Dad stared at the hillside for a long moment, then put his hand on my shoulder. Maybe it was a bear standing up. They do that sometimes. It wasn't a bear, I said firmly. It was walking like a person, but not like a person at the same time, and it had these really long arms. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he didn't believe me. The mind can play tricks sometimes, especially in new places. The shadows from the canyon walls, the way the light hits things. I didn't argue anymore. What was the point? We got back in the car and continued our vacation. My parents didn't bring it up again, except to joke occasionally about my wild imagination. I stopped talking about it too. It became this weird thing that hung in the air, but nobody acknowledged. For years, I tried to convince myself that maybe my dad was right. Maybe it was just shadows or a bear or my imagination running wild, but I knew what I saw. I still know. The strangest part came 7 years later, in 1992. I was 19 by then, home from college for the summer. My parents had gotten the travel bug again and suggested we revisit Colorado. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I went along with it. We ended up stopping at this little diner in a town near the same canyon. While we were eating lunch, my dad started chatting with our waitress, asking about local attractions. "Well, the canyon's always beautiful," she said, refilling our coffee cups. "But watch out for our local celebrity." She laughed, but there was something uneasy about it. "Local celebrity?" my mom asked. "Oh, you know, the Bigfoot stories." The waitress shrugged. "A lot of folks around here claim they've seen something in that canyon. Ranchers losing cattle, hikers finding strange footprints. Last year, the Hendersons found weird fur stuck to their back screen door. Not bear fur, they swear. Too long and coarse, they said. I remember my fork stopping halfway to my mouth. My parents were suddenly very quiet. "Where exactly do people see this thing?" my dad asked, his voice careful. "Mostly in the western part of the canyon, where it widens out a bit. There's those cattle pastures that come down near the road." She was describing exactly where we'd been 7 years earlier. The car ride after that lunch was silent for a long time. Finally, my dad cleared his throat. "About what you saw that day." "Yeah?" My heart was racing again. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you." It was the closest thing to validation I'd ever gotten, and honestly, it scared me more than it comforted me, because if I really did see what I think I saw, then there are things out there that we don't understand. We didn't go back to the canyon on that trip. None of us suggested it, and nobody questioned why. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. I've read about bears, about how they can look human-like when standing. I've read about hunters in ghillie suits, about hoaxes in costumes. Nothing fits. No bear moves the way that thing moved. No human is that large. No costume looks that natural from the distance I saw it. What bothers me most isn't that I saw it, but that it seemed so ordinary. It wasn't attacking anything. It wasn't doing anything spectacular. It was just walking like it had somewhere to be. Like this was its normal routine, wandering through cattle pastures in broad daylight. That makes it feel more real to me somehow. If I were making it up, wouldn't I have imagined something more dramatic? I don't know what I saw that day in 1985. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or whatever name people give these things. All I know is that it was real, it was massive, and for a brief moment, our worlds overlapped. And even now, almost 4 decades later, I still find myself looking a little more carefully when I drive through wooded areas, wondering if something's watching me from just beyond the tree line. Story 16. I've been holding on to this memory for nearly 60 years, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. This happened during the summer of '63, when I was just 9 years old. My family lived in Central Oregon, and I practically grew up in the woods. My grandfather and uncle had taught me how to track animals since I was old enough to walk. By 9, I could identify deer, elk, bear, and cougar tracks without hesitation. I knew the difference between a rabbit and a hare just by their prints. That's important to understand because what I saw that day didn't match anything I'd been taught. It was early July, hot but not scorching yet. My grandfather, we called him Pops, my mother, my younger brother Donnie, who was 7, and I drove out to the Cascade Lakes Highway for a day trip. We were headed to Teddy's Lake in the Three Sisters Wilderness. It wasn't as popular back then as some of the other lakes, which is why Pops liked it. Fewer folks means better fishing, he always said. We parked off the highway and hiked in with our gear. It wasn't a difficult hike, maybe 30 minutes through pine forest. I remember the smell of the trees baking in the sun and how the needles crunched under our boots. Pops carried most of the fishing gear, while I proudly lugged the lunch my mom had packed. Donnie complained about the walk, but Mum kept him going with promises of spotting chipmunks. When we reached the lake, it was perfectly still, like glass reflecting the mountains. Back then, the Forest Service kept a couple of wooden rowboats tied up at a small dock for public use. Different times. Pops inspected one of the boats, declared it ship-shape enough, and we loaded our gear. Pops rowed us out to what he called the sweet spot near the middle of the lake. Mom helped Donnie with his fishing rod, while I baited my own hook just like Pops had taught me. We fished quietly for about an hour, catching a few rainbow trout. Nothing spectacular, but enough to keep it interesting. Donnie got bored after catching one small fish and started fidgeting, looking around at the shoreline. "Can we explore the rest of the lake?" he asked, pointing toward the far end where there was a small cove with what looked like a tiny island near its mouth. Pops glanced at his watch, then at the sky. "Sure, we've got plenty of daylight left. Let's see what's over there." He started rowing toward the cove. As we got closer, I could see the island better. It wasn't much, maybe 30 feet across, with a few scrubby pines and some boulders. The water between the island and the shore was shallow, with reeds growing in patches. We were about 50 yards from the island when we heard it. A loud splashing sound from the other side, not like a fish jumping, more like something big moving through water. "What was that?" Mum asked, her hand automatically reaching for Donnie's shoulder. "Probably just a deer coming down for a drink," Pop said, but I noticed he'd stopped rowing and was listening intently. The splashing continued for a few seconds, then stopped. Pop started rowing again, this time a bit faster, angling us around the island toward where we'd heard the noise. By the time we rounded the island, whatever had been there was gone. All that remained was rippling water spreading outward from the shoreline. Pops rowed us closer to shore, his eyes scanning the tree line. I was doing the same, but saw nothing moving in the woods. "Let's check it out," Pop said, maneuvering the boat toward a muddy section of shoreline where the reeds were flattened. When we reached the shallows, Pop shipped the oars and let the boat drift until it nudged into the mud. He climbed out, the water only reaching his ankles, and helped secure the boat so we could all get out without getting wet. That's when we saw them, the tracks. I'll never forget that moment. Pops froze, staring at the ground, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't exactly fear, but something close to it, confusion maybe, mixed with disbelief. "Bobby," he said to me quietly, "come look at this and tell me what you see." I stepped carefully to where he was standing and looked down at the mud. Clear as day, there was a line of footprints leading from the water's edge up toward the trees. But they weren't animal tracks. At least not any animal I recognized. They were footprints, human-shaped footprints, except they weren't human at all. Each print was enormous, at least 15 inches long and proportionally wide. They were deeply pressed into the mud, much deeper than a human print would be, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The shape was unmistakably a foot with 5 toes, but the toes were splayed out wider than a human's would be. What struck me most was how clear they were. You could see every detail: the ball of the foot, the arch, which was flatter than a human's, the heel, and those widespread toes, and they were fresh. Water was still seeping into the deepest parts of the impressions. Pops knelt down and examined one of the tracks closely. He placed his hand next to it for scale, and his whole hand barely covered the width of the print. "What made these, Pops?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the stride length between prints. They were spaced far apart, at least 4 feet between each step. Whatever made these was tall and took massive strides. "Not sure, Bobby," he finally said. "Not a bear, that's for certain. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for this distance, and look at how deep these are pressed into the mud." My mother had come over by this point, keeping Donnie back by the boat. "What is it?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Pops straightened up, brushing mud from his hands. "Some kind of tracks I've never seen before," he said simply. He didn't want to frighten Mom or Donnie, but I could tell he was puzzled. "Can we follow them?" I asked eagerly. Despite my unease, the tracker in me wanted to solve this mystery. Pops nodded. "You and I will. Mom and Donnie can stay with the boat." Mom didn't like this plan, but knew arguing with Pops was pointless when he used that tone. "Don't go far," was all she said. Pops and I followed the tracks away from the water. They led straight into the forest, clear in the mud near the shore, then visible in patches of soft ground between the pine needles. The creature had been moving fast, based on the stride length, but not running. About 30 yards into the forest, the ground became covered with a thick layer of pine needles, and the tracks disappeared. Pops circled the area, looking for any sign, broken twigs, disturbed vegetation, anything. But there was nothing obvious. Whatever had made those tracks knew how to move through the forest without leaving much sign. "Pops, what do you think it was?" I asked again as we stood in the silent forest. He looked down at me, then up at the surrounding trees. "In all my years in these woods, I've never seen tracks like those," he admitted. "Your uncle and I have tracked everything from mountain lions to bears, but these..." He shook his head. "Could it be a, Bigfoot?" I whispered the word, almost afraid to say it out loud. There had been stories in the papers that year. A couple of construction workers up in Washington claimed they'd filmed one. Most folks laughed it off, but not everyone. Pops didn't laugh at my question. "I don't know what to believe about those stories," he said thoughtfully, "but I know tracks, and these were made by something walking on 2 legs that's bigger than any man I've ever met." We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us listening to the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, just the faint rustle of wind in the pines. "Let's head back," Pops finally said. "We've gone far enough." As we turned to go, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, something dark shifting behind a large Douglas fir about 50 yards away. I froze, staring at the spot, but saw nothing more. "What is it?" Pops asked, noticing my sudden stillness. "I thought I saw something move over there." I pointed toward the tree. Pops stared hard in that direction for a long moment, then put his hand on my shoulder. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get back to your mom and Donnie." We walked back to the shore faster than we'd ventured in. Mum could tell something was wrong by the look on our faces, but she didn't ask questions in front of Donnie. Pops helped us all back into the boat and rowed us away from that shoreline with steady, purposeful strokes. As we rounded the island again, heading back toward the main part of the lake, I kept my eyes on the shoreline we'd just left. That's when I saw it, or at least I think I did. Standing half concealed among the trees was a large dark shape. It was only visible for a few seconds before it stepped back into the shadows, but it was tall, much taller than a man, and covered in what looked like dark fur. I couldn't make out features at that distance, but the impression of size and power was unmistakable. "Pops," I whispered urgently, but when I looked at him, I could tell from his expression that he'd seen it too. He gave me a small shake of his head, A silent instruction not to draw attention to it or alarm Mom and Donnie. We fished a little longer on the main part of the lake, but our hearts weren't in it anymore. Pops kept scanning the shoreline, especially near the island cove. When we finally packed up and hiked back to our car, he made sure I walked directly in front of him, with Mom and Donnie leading the way. That night, after Donnie had gone to bed, Pops, Mom and I sat at the kitchen table. Mom finally asked what we'd found in the woods. Tracks, Pops said simply. Big ones, like nothing I've seen before. Like what? Mom pressed. Pops hesitated. Like the stories. The Bigfoot stories. Mom started to scoff, but stopped when she saw his expression. You're serious, she said. I don't know what made those tracks, Pops replied. But they were real, they were fresh. And they were made by something big walking on two legs that isn't human. They made me promise not to talk about it at school. People will think you're making it up, Mom said. But Pops pulled me aside later and told me to trust what I'd seen with my own eyes. Sometimes there are things in this world we don't understand yet, he said. Pops passed away when I was in my 20s. Before he died, he mentioned that day at Teddy's Lake only once more. We were hunting deer, just the two of us, and had stopped to rest on a fallen log. I've spent my whole life in these woods, he said suddenly. And that thing we saw that day is the only time I've ever felt like I wasn't at the top of the food chain. I've been back to Teddy's Lake many times over the years. The Forest Service doesn't keep boats there anymore. The island is still there, and sometimes I sit on the opposite shore watching that cove, wondering. I've never seen tracks like that again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the deep woods, I get a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. And I remember those massive footprints in the mud, the unnatural silence in the forest, and that dark shape disappearing into the shadows. To this day, I can't explain what we saw, but I know what we didn't see. We didn't see a bear or an elk or any other animal native to the Cascades. Whatever was on that island that day had been watching us fish from across the lake and only left when we got too close. That's not normal wildlife behavior, not even close, Alan. Story 17. I still get chills thinking about what happened to me in White River National Forest. It's been 8 years since that day in June, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, thinking I hear those footsteps coming after me. It was June 13th, 2015. I remember the date perfectly because I'd been planning that hike for weeks. I'm pretty experienced with Colorado trails, been hiking them since I was a teenager. And White River was one of my favorites. Nothing fancy that day, just a regular day hike. No camping, just me, my day pack, some water, trail mix, and my camera. I got to this smaller trailhead right after sunrise. It's one of those secondary access points that mostly locals know about, not the main entrance where all the tourists go. The morning was perfect, cool, clear, birds singing. The parking lot was nearly empty, just two other vehicles there. One was this old blue Subaru with a bunch of hiking stickers. The other, a newer-looking Ford pickup, normal stuff for a trailhead in Colorado. Before heading out, I did my usual stretching by my truck. That's when I noticed something weird near the edge of the parking lot. There was this backpack, half buried in some tall weeds next to a boulder. At first I thought someone had just forgotten it, but something felt off about it. The way it was positioned looked strange, like it had been dragged or thrown. I walked over to check it out, thinking maybe I could find some ID and turn it into the ranger station later. When I got close, my stomach dropped. The backpack was completely shredded, and not just torn. It had these long, parallel slashes across the back panel, 4 distinct gashes, perfectly spaced, cutting clean through the heavy-duty nylon. I've seen damage from wear and tear, from animals, from people cutting things with knives. This wasn't any of that. These were claw marks, big ones. The gouges were deep and powerful, like whatever made them had incredible strength. The contents were spilled out everywhere, a metal water bottle, dented but intact, a small first aid kit, some energy bars, and what used to be a sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was absolutely destroyed, with stuffing scattered several yards in one direction, like something had grabbed it and shaken it violently. I looked through everything, but there was no ID, no wallet, no phone, nothing to tell me whose pack it was or what had happened to them. I remember thinking maybe a bear had gotten into someone's gear. But even as I thought it, I knew bear damage doesn't look like that. Bears tear and rip randomly. These slashes were deliberate. I should have turned around right then. Every instinct was telling me something was wrong, but I brushed it off. I told myself it was probably some weird prank, or maybe park rangers had left it there after dealing with whatever animal had damaged it. Stupid rationalizations. But I'd been looking forward to this hike for too long to bail. So I started up the trail, trying to shake off the uneasiness. The first half-mile was fine, just your typical Colorado forest trail, winding through lodgepole pines with occasional views of the mountains. I was starting to relax again, taking photos, getting into the rhythm of the hike. About a mile in, the trail started to climb alongside this steeper slope. I was focusing on my footing when I heard something crack from above me on the hillside. A sharp, distinct sound, like a large branch breaking under weight. I stopped and looked up, but couldn't see anything through the trees. I figured it was probably an elk or maybe a deer. They're common enough in that area. I started walking again, but slower, more alert. Then another crack followed, louder this time, definitely closer. That's when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped calling. The constant background chatter of the forest just disappeared. All I could hear was the faint whisper of wind through the pines. That silence was worse than any noise. Anyone who spends time in the wilderness knows that when the forest goes quiet, something's wrong. I picked up my pace, not running yet, but moving faster, wanting to get to a more open area. The trail wound around a bend and opened into a small meadow with a junction where another trail crossed mine. I stopped there to catch my breath and get my bearings. That's when I saw it. At the far edge of the meadow, where the trees created a dark line against the grass, something moved. At first, I thought it was just shadows shifting with the clouds. Then it stepped forward, and I felt my entire body go cold. It was massive, standing upright on two legs, taller than any human I've ever seen. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing would have towered over me by at least 2 more feet, maybe more. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms hanging low, longer than they should be. Its entire frame was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like a shaggy coat that moved with the breeze. Even from over 100 yards away, its size was undeniable. When it took another step forward, sunlight caught its face, and I could make out features. Deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow ridge, a wide, flat nose, a mouth that seemed to be set in a permanent grimace. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I recognized from years in these mountains. When it took another deliberate step forward, my survival instinct finally kicked in. I grabbed my pack and ran. Not back the way I came, that would have taken me closer to it, but down the other trail at the junction, which I knew eventually connected back to the main trail. The moment I moved, a sound erupted behind me that I'll never forget. A low, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the trees and into my chest. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard, not a bear's roar or an elk's bugle. It was deeper, angrier, almost purposeful. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. The trail was rocky and uneven, and I kept stumbling, barely catching myself. Behind me I could hear it coming, heavy footfalls smashing through underbrush, branches breaking. It was chasing me, and it was fast, much faster than something that size should be able to move. At one point, I glanced back over my shoulder. It was fully on the trail now, less than 50 yards behind me. In that brief look, I saw it clearly. Easily over 8 feet tall, moving with these long, powerful strides that ate up the ground between us. Its arms swung as it ran, hands the size of dinner plates with fingers that ended in what looked like thick, curved claws. I knew I couldn't outrun it. Not on the trail. In desperation, I veered off the path and threw myself down a steep slope toward a creek I could hear below. I half ran, half fell down the incline, grabbing at saplings to slow my descent. My backpack caught on a branch and ripped loose, but I didn't care. I kept going. I hit the creek hard, splashing through knee-deep water, the cold shock momentarily clearing my panic. I scrambled up the opposite bank and ran parallel to the trail, knowing it would curve back this way eventually. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing down the slope, a landslide of dirt and rocks following it. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like rubber, but pure terror kept me moving. I finally spotted the main trail ahead and pushed toward it with everything I had left. The forest thinned out as I approached the parking area, and I could see my truck. I reached it and yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. As I slammed the door shut and hit the lock button, I could hear it, just inside the tree line. That deep, rhythmic breathing, the sound of branches shifting as it moved. It stayed there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, with one last rumbling roar that seemed to shake my truck, it retreated back into the forest. I sat there shaking, keys in my hand, unable to put them in the ignition. My clothes were soaked with sweat and creek water. My legs and arms were covered in scratches from my desperate scramble down the slope. I couldn't stop trembling. That backpack at the trailhead suddenly made horrifying sense. It hadn't been a coincidence or a prank. It had been a warning. That thing had been there, near the parking lot, maybe watching as hikers came and went. The claw marks matched what I'd glimpsed on its hands. It took me about 20 minutes to calm down enough to drive. I kept watching the tree line, expecting to see it emerge again, but it didn't. It was like it had escorted me out of its territory and was satisfied once I was gone. I've thought about that day constantly since then, about how the creature chased me until I reached open ground, then stopped, like there was a boundary it wouldn't cross. About how deliberate its actions seemed, not just animal instinct, but something more intelligent. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I'd sound crazy. I know what I saw, though. I know what chased me. I still hike. I still love the mountains. But I've never gone back to that part of White River National Forest alone. These days, I carry a firearm when I hike. Though deep down, I doubt it would do much against something that size and that powerful. Sometimes when I'm on remote trails and the birds suddenly go quiet, I get that same feeling, like I'm being watched from just beyond the trees. Whatever I encountered that day wanted me gone, and it made damn sure I knew it. Sometimes I wonder about the owner of that shredded backpack. Did they have an encounter like mine? Did they escape? Or did they become another mysterious disappearance in our national forests that no one can explain? I don't have answers. I just know what I saw, what chased me, what haunts my dreams. Something impossibly large, unnaturally fast, and terrifyingly real was in those woods. And for all I know, it's still there. Story 18. I've never been good at telling stories, but what happened to me on July 9th, 1967 has haunted me every day since. I've told this to a few people over the years, mostly family, and they usually give me that look, you know the one, like they're humoring me. My wife believes me because she saw how messed up I was when I got home, but I thought maybe writing it down here might help someone else who's experienced something similar. I was driving truck back then, hauling vegetables from Nebraska down through the South. Decent money, but the hours were brutal. That night, I was somewhere near Brooksville in Hernando County, Florida. It was past midnight, probably closer to 1 in the morning, and I'd been on the road since 5 a.m. the previous day. The fatigue hit me like a ton of bricks. You know that feeling when your eyelids get so heavy you can't keep them open, when the white lines on the road start to blur? I'd been fighting it for about 30 miles, slapping myself, singing along to the radio, anything to stay awake. But there comes a point when you realize you're more dangerous on the road than off it. I remember spotting this wide gravel turnout just off this small highway. It wasn't an official rest area or anything, just a patch where the shoulder widened out. I pulled over, figuring I'd catch a couple hours of sleep before pushing on. It was hot as hell that night. Typical Florida in July. I killed the engine, but left my keys in the ignition so I could run the cab lights. I rolled down the windows a crack, then thought better of it and just opened the passenger door all the way for some cross-ventilation. I didn't even take off my boots, just leaned the seat back and closed my eyes. I couldn't have been dozing more than 15-20 minutes when I heard it. That distinctive sound of gravel crunching under footsteps. My first thought was, shit, it's a state trooper, and he's gonna tell me I can't park here. So I sat up and reached over to flip on the interior lights, figuring I'd better have my license and logbook ready. That's when I saw it. I've spent 55 years trying to find the right words to describe what I saw leaning into my cab, and I still don't have them. It was tall. Christ, it was tall. Probably 7 feet at least. Wide shoulders, massive arms, and completely covered in dark, shaggy hair. Not fur exactly, more like human hair, but all over its body. It wasn't a bear standing up. I'd seen those before in Nebraska. This thing's proportions were all wrong for a bear. Its face, God, its face. It was like someone had mixed up a man and an ape and got it all wrong. The features were pushed in, almost like a gorilla, but not quite. The eyes reflected the cab light. 2 yellowish orbs staring right at me. I remember thinking, this isn't happening, I'm dreaming this. But then the smell hit me. That wasn't a dream. It was like rotten meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. So powerful it made my eyes water. I froze, completely froze, couldn't even scream. It just stared at me for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple seconds. Then, before I could even think to react, these enormous hands shot through the open door and grabbed my legs. Its fingers wrapped all the way around my calves. One quick yank, and I was being dragged across the seat. I remember grabbing for anything. The steering wheel, the gear shift, but my head smacked against the shifter as it pulled me out. The pain was sharp, immediate. I saw stars, felt warm blood trickling down my temple. Next thing I knew, I was hanging upside down, tucked under its arm like I was nothing more than a rolled-up newspaper. My truck wasn't that high off the ground, but this thing didn't even have to duck to carry me out. I could feel its muscles against my side, solid, like hitting a brick wall. The strength in it was unbelievable. I'm not a small guy, 6 foot 200 pounds back then, but it carried me like I was a child. It took me around to the front of my truck. I remember seeing the chrome grille below me, the license plate, all these bizarre details your mind latches onto when you're terrified. It stopped there, right in the beams of my headlights, and I got my first full look at it. The hair was dark brown, almost black, and covered everything except parts of its face. The chest was massive, probably twice as wide as mine. It just stood there, holding me like it was trying to decide what to do next. Was it going to eat me? Take me somewhere? I don't know which scared me more. I started struggling then, kicking my legs, swinging my arms, anything to get free. It didn't seem to notice at first. My fists bounced off its body like I was hitting a padded wall. The whole time, I'm breathing in that awful stench. It was so bad I thought I might vomit. There was something primal about that smell, something that triggered a deep fear I didn't even know I had. I remember thinking, this is how I die. In the middle of nowhere, Florida, killed by something that shouldn't even exist. I don't know if it was luck or desperation, but I managed to twist just enough that I could brace my feet against the front fender of my truck. I pushed with everything I had, every last bit of strength. For a second, nothing happened. Then it shifted its weight, just slightly off balance. That was enough. I pushed again, harder, and somehow slipped from its grip. I hit the ground hard, scraping my palms and knees on the gravel, but I didn't feel the pain. Adrenaline had taken over. I scrambled to my feet and ran like hell back toward my cab. I could hear it behind me, this weird grunt-breathing sound. I didn't look back. I just ran. I practically dove into the driver's seat, yanked the door shut and locked it. Passenger side too. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the keys still hanging in the ignition. I turned them and the engine roared to life, but I wasn't quick enough. It reached the truck and slammed its fist against the side panel. The whole cab shook like I'd been sideswiped by another semi. Then again, wham, against my door. The window rattled in its frame. I was sure the glass would break. Another hit, and I heard metal denting. It was pounding on my truck like it was nothing more than a tin can. In my panic, I hit the air horn. That long, loud blast cut through the night. The creature jumped back, actually jumped, like it was startled by the noise. I laid on that horn again, and it backed up further. I could see it clearly in my headlights now. Its massive silhouette, those long arms hanging down past its knees. It turned and ran. Not lumbering like you'd expect something that size to move, but ran fast, across the highway and into a field. In seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I kept my hand on that horn while my other foot floored the accelerator. Gravel sprayed everywhere as I pulled back onto the highway. I didn't care about speed limits or rest hours or anything else. I just drove. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every shadow on the road looked like that thing ready to jump out at me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station just off the interstate, maybe 20 miles away. It was one of those 24-hour places with the bright fluorescent lights. I parked right under the biggest light I could find and just sat there, engine running, trying to make sense of what had happened. The cut on my head had mostly stopped bleeding, but my shirt was stained with blood. My knees and palms were raw from the gravel. There was no way I'd imagined it. I went inside, cleaned myself up best I could in the bathroom. The attendant asked if I'd been in an accident. I just nodded. What was I supposed to say? A Bigfoot tried to abduct me. He'd have called the cops thinking I was drunk or high. I drank 3 cups of coffee, waited until sunrise, then drove to the nearest police station in the next town over. I don't know why I thought they'd believe me, but I had to report it. The officer who took my statement was polite enough, but I could tell he thought I was crazy, or drunk, or both. He wrote everything down, though, even examined the dents on my truck door. 3 large indentations that didn't look like any accident damage he'd seen before. Then he said something that chilled me. He mentioned they'd had other reports in that general area. Strange sightings, livestock going missing. He suggested it might be an escaped gorilla from a private collection or roadside zoo. Said they'd look into it, but I know what I saw wasn't any gorilla. Gorillas don't stand 7 feet tall. They don't have that build, that face. They don't move the way this thing moved. I finished my delivery that day, but I was a wreck, jumpy, paranoid, checking my mirrors constantly. I took a different route home, adding almost 200 miles to my trip just to avoid that stretch of highway. When I got back to Nebraska, I quit long-haul driving altogether, found a local route that kept me close to home and away from remote roads at night. It's been 55 years, and I've never driven through Central Florida again. Never will. I still have nightmares about those hands grabbing me, that smell. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can smell it in my bedroom. My wife has to talk me down, remind me we're in Nebraska, far away from whatever that was. I've read books about Bigfoot sightings over the years, watched those TV shows where they go looking for them. Most of it seems like nonsense to me. But every now and then, I hear a description that matches what I saw that night, and my blood runs cold. People laugh about Bigfoot, treat it like some kind of joke. Trust me, there was nothing funny about what happened to me. I don't know what it was or why it grabbed me. Was it curious, hungry, territorial? I'll never know. But I know what I saw, what I felt, what I smelled. That was real. And it's out there still, probably. Walking around in those woods while people drive by, never knowing how close they are to something that shouldn't exist.